If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 21. Why isn't it working? It's sealed shut. Zuko could feel his temper boiling, already threatening to overspill. Objectively, he knew that he was prone to making bad decisions when he was like this, but he just couldn't help himself. He'd had him. Had the avatar literally right there in his hands. Only to be caught off guard by a simple trick and let him slip through his fingers. One door was all that stood in the way of him rectifying his mistake. One door that should swing open when 5 firebenders working together bent fire through it. But of course, in typical Zuko fashion, the spirits had decided that now was the perfect time for whatever mechanisms controlled the door to not work properly. It must have been the light. Avatar Roku doesn't want us inside. One of the sages supplied. With a frustrated growl, Zuko fired one last blast of flames at the door, more as a release for his anger than anything else, and turned around to storm over towards the captive sage. "Why did you help the avatar?" he demanded. The traitorous sage stared back at him, not with the defiance or anger he was expecting, but with a peculiar mix of melancholy and pride. "Because it was once the sage's duty," he replied. "It is still our duty." Duty? How could this man talk of duty? His first and foremost duty was to the Fire Lord, like all children of the Fire Nation. Surely his duty towards his own people should come before all else? Yet before Zuko could respond, he was cut off by the sound of clapping. What a moving and heartfelt performance! "I'm certain the Fire Lord will understand, when you explain why you betrayed him." A scowl flashed across Zuko's face as he looked over to the staircase. Zhao had finally arrived, and with a small guard of firebenders in tow. All around him the fire sages bowed low, showing a respect for the commander that they hadn't shown to him. "And Prince Zuko?" Zhao continued as his soldiers moved forwards to seize his arms. "It was a noble effort, but your little smokescreen didn't work." Tanya made sure of that. He looked around, an uncharacteristic look of concern adorning his face. "Where is she anyway?" "You're too late, Zhao. Both the avatar and your pet demon are inside, and the doors are sealed shut." Zuko spat defiantly. Zhao eyes the doors for a second. Then, much to the surprise of everyone else, burst out into raucous laughter. "So you're telling me that an untrained, inexperienced avatar is locked in that room with the most monstrously powerful firebender of her generation, a girl who I've personally witnessed burn entire ships of people to ashes single-handedly, and I should be worried?" he asked, a grin that spoke of absolute confidence on his face. "You know her better than most, Zuko. Do you envy anyone being locked in a room with her? Sooner or later those doors will have to open again, and then the avatar will be mine. Or whatever's left of him anyway." Aang listened as intently as Roku explained about the coming of Sozin's comet, how the Fire Lord planned to use it to bring an end to the war, and how it was his destiny to master all 4 elements and defeat him. The pressure of having the fate of the world rest on his shoulders was terrifying. "What if I can't master all the elements in time? What if I fail?" he asked. Roku smiled gently, his expression showing how familiar he was with what Aang was feeling. No matter when or where they were born, it was a pressure that all avatars were destined to bear eventually. "I know you can do it, Aang, for you have done it before." Those few words did wonders to soothe Aang's mind. Yes, he was the same soul as every previous avatar, and they had all managed to rise to the challenges they faced and protect the world. If they could do it, so could he. "The solstice is ending. Our time grows short," Roku declared. "But before you go, there is one more thing I need to share with you. Tell me, Aang, what do you know of worlds?" The question seemed like a fairly random one, and threw Aang for a moment. Well, there's the physical world, where humans and animals live, and the spirit world, where spirits live." "True. The human world and spirit world are entwined tightly together in balance, like yin and yang. One cannot survive without the other, and under the right circumstances it is possible to travel between the two," Roku explained. "Yet these are not the only worlds in existence. Creation is vast and unending, and life exists in many forms across an infinity of worlds bound by a variety of rules." That was fascinating and all, but Aang didn't really see what that had to do with the Fire Lords. His expression must have given away what he was thinking, for Roku sighed and continued. "As these other worlds are not entwined like our 2 worlds are, traversing between them is incredibly difficult. Difficult, but not impossible. Sometimes exceptionally powerful beings are able to travel to other worlds, and not always for innocent reasons. 14 years ago an incredibly powerful spirit from another world forced its way into the spirit world. We do not know who it was or why it came, but individually it was stronger than any spirit in our world. However, despite this it was not strong enough to face the combined might of all spirits together, and quickly retreated. At the time we thought it had gone forever, but then last year it reappeared once again, only making contact with a single mortal before fleeing. It was then we realized that it had made a window into our world during its first visit, and has been watching the war unfold from behind the scenes for over a decade now. But why? Aang asked. What purpose would a spirit from another world have for watching this one? Roku's face grew grave. As I said before, Aang, the physical world and spirit world are closely entwined. As the war unbalanced the physical world, so too does it unbalance the spirit world. Every forest burned down by an invading army, every river dammed to bring famine and drought, weakens the spirits associated with it. If this war continues and the world completely falls under the Fire Lord's sway, the spirit world will be weakened like never before. It would be the perfect opportunity for this foreign spirit to invade and take control, establishing themselves as the one and only spirit that the Fire Nation need ever worship. Aang's face furrowed in concern. But we don't know for sure what that otherworldly spirit is intending, right? All it's ever done is speak with one person. That was the case, until mere seconds ago. Roku answered. The moment the solstice began, the barriers between the physical and spirit worlds within this room weakened, allowing us to communicate. Yet at that very moment the foreign spirit appeared once again, and used the opportunity to contact a mortal of their own. Contact? But who? Aang's eyes widened as he understood the implications. There had only been one other person in the room besides himself that the spirit could have communicated with. The golden-haired girl. Yes. Roku confirmed. That girl is a mystery, even to the spirits. No one has ever seen her soul before in any past incarnations, yet she fights like one who was born with a weapon in her hand. I fear that she, as well as whoever was contacted last year, have been chosen as the agents of this otherworldly spirit in whatever scheme it has devised. Be careful around her, Aang. But she's in the room with me now. The moment the solstice finishes, she could kill me. Aang replied. A small, confident smile curled up on the corner of Roku's mouth. I can help you with that. But only if you are ready. Chapter 22. Tanya glanced warily around the world of white mist she'd found herself in. Clearly the Royal Fire Academy's curriculum was in sore need of updating. She'd been taught that the Avatar was the only being in the world that could bend all four elements, and that they possessed a powerful connection to the spirits. What they'd apparently failed to mention was that they could trap people in some kind of alternate mist dimension. If she'd known that was a trick they had up their sleeve, she'd have never engaged him in a direct confrontation. More worrying was the fact that there was no visible exit in sight. A few strands of worry began to worm uncomfortably inside of her, but through force of will she bottled them up. Now was not the time for panic. If there was an entrance, then there must also be an exit somewhere, she just had to find it. And if there is no escape, what will you do? Will you pray for her salvation? Tanya gritted her teeth by reflex. It had been a lifetime since she'd last heard it, but she'd recognized that smarmy-ass disembodied voice anywhere. Her nemesis finally revealed himself. Being X. She stated dispassionately. I wondered when you'd come crawling out of the woodwork. Though she couldn't physically see him, Tanya just knew the Being X had some condescending glare on whatever his equivalent for a face was. Prideful as ever, I see. So what's you plan this time around, HMM? What scheme has the All-So-Mighty One concocted to make this blasphemous wretch see the light? Tanya asked sarcastically. Send her off to fight in a war again? Top marks for creativity there, especially after it worked out so well last time. She'd been expecting some sort of arrogant retort from Being X, but to Tanya's surprise when his voice spoke again it was laced with amusement. Ah, but this is not quite the same as last time. You are to be congratulated, Tanya, for I have learned something from you. There are not many across all planes of existence who can claim to have taught a lesson to a god. Oh really? This, Tanya decided, did not sound good. And what exactly did I teach you? I believed that, when faced with the horrors of their own self-made wars, all mortals would fall back to praying to the divine for salvation. And I was half correct, for the vast majority do. But it would seem that there is one soul in every million that is so wretched, so debased, that they actually thrive in such horror. They soak up blood to sate their hunger for violence like a flower soaks up water, and grow amongst battlefields littered with the bodies of their fallen comrades and victims alike. You, heathen, are one such flower of war. Her? Thrive in war? Ha! This was further proof that being X was no true god, for if he really was all-knowing he'd have surely known that Tanya despised war. All it was good for was sending young men and women blessed with intelligent minds and the potential to become something productive for society to early graves. If that's true, then what is the point in sending me to yet another battlefield? Tanya asked. What's so different about this one? It was something that occurred to me as I heard the prayers of the soldiers who fought against you. Do you know how many begged me for salvation when they heard you had arrived at the battlefield? How many implored me to enact vengeance upon you as they watched you shooting down their friends one by one? How many prayed for deliverance before a single shot from you obliterated their city? Though many soldiers were able to put aside their fear of death when they joined the war, it came crashing back into them whenever they saw you. It made me realize something about human nature. You humans are such simple, narrow-minded creatures that you struggle to grasp the full gravity of a situation you are faced with until it is made easier to identify, until it wears a face and a name. For those soldiers you became the very face of war, of death itself, and as such became a conduit through which they could understand the weight and fear of those concepts. You became an avatar of war. Oh no! A sinking feeling welled up in Tanya's stomach as she started to realize where this was heading. Don't tell me. Yes. Being X replied smugly. The only way one such as you can comprehend the wrath of a god is for it to be channeled into a mortal coil. In your previous life the one who brought you closest to despair was Mary, yet she was merely a mortal granted a fraction of a god's power to play with, an ill-fitting vessel. For you to finally grasp the wrath of a god, you must face a god incarnate. Thus I devised a new life for you, a new destiny, all to set you up to face a real god in mortal flesh. The Avatar. For a moment Tanya was silent. Then, with a loud snort, she burst out into laughter. That's your plan? She gasped out between breaths. You think a little bald child is going to put the fear of God into me? Have you seen that brat? Ha! What's he gonna do, huff and puff and blow my house down? Yet when Being X2 started laughing, Tanya found her humor quickly died up. Your pride will be your undoing, heathen. His voice echoed, as all around her the mist started to fade. You have yet to see what the Avatar is capable of. But you're about to. In the span of a mere moment the white fog faded, and Tanya found herself standing back in the middle of the shrine as if she'd never left at all. So after all this time waiting, Being X finally revealed that his master plan was to intimidate her by pitting her in a war against a pacifist monk child? How ridiculous! He'd even put her on the winning side at that. How could she possibly lose? Sorry about that. She began casually, feeling a spike in confidence as she turned back to the cowering Avatar, resummoning the flaming dagger in her hand. Now, where were we? She abruptly froze as she finally noticed the one difference in the room. The Avatar. Where before a frightened child had lay, now stood a tall man in regal red robes. Long white hair seemed to sway as if blown by some unfelt wind, and an ethereal blue glow radiated from him like a holy light. His eyes shone a similar blue color with such brightness that they obscured his pupils, and though it was impossible to tell for certain, Tanya was sure that his eyes were fixed disapprovingly on hers. It was impossible not to recognize him, not with a statue of his very image looming right behind him. A Avatar Roku. Was this what the Avatar had hoped to learn by coming here? It made sense. Why bother mastering all four elements himself when he could simply learn to transform into his older, stronger past incarnation in an instant? A fully fledged Avatar like Roku would be able to match even the Fire Lord. A feeling of dread washed over Tanya, causing her to instinctively step backwards. She could feel the Avatar's power crackling in the air like electricity, and every single one of the instincts she'd developed to keep herself alive in the battlefield screamed at her to run for her life, for the enemy before her was someone she stood absolutely no chance of defeating. So shocked was she by this turn of events that she hadn't even noticed the doors opening behind her until Zhao's voice echoed out from behind her. Fire! Only her instincts reacting to the sound of fire being conjured behind her saved her life, as she ducked down just in time to avoid the multiple streams of fire that flew over her head towards Roku. But Roku simply stretched out his hands, wresting control of the vast quantity of flames away from their creators and redirecting them to swirl around him in a burning circle. Then he thrust out his hands again, and Tanya had the foresight to create a shield of flames in front of herself a second before a wave of fire unlike any she'd ever felt crashed over her. The force behind it sent her flying backwards out of the room and into a pillar, just as it knocked Zhao and his men to their feet and melted the chains around Zuko and the Avatar's friends. Avatar Roku is going to destroy the temple. We have to get out of here. One of the sages shouted as the other turned to flee from Roku's wrath. A second later his warning proved true, as Roku punched the ground with enough force to send a shockwave rippling through the island. At his call the ground began to shake, and bubbling pools of lava began to hiss and crackle as they erupted through the cracks. Tanya was busy blinking away the spots swimming in her eyes when a firm hand grasped her by the forearm. We have to go. Now. Zhao growled, not giving her a chance to reply as he threw her over his shoulder and began to run, leading the way for his men as they fled from the rapidly collapsing temple. As humiliating as it was to have to be carried like a child, Tanya had to admit that just guarding against Roku's attack had left her so weak she wasn't sure her legs would be steady enough to carry her. She hadn't seen that much destructive power from a single person since Mary, and back then she'd never been crazy enough to take one of her attacks head-on. However, while Mary had been a berserker, throwing her power around madly in a wild rampage, Roku had wielded his strength as if it were an extension of himself. He had absolute control of his power, and was infinitely more dangerous because of it. And this was the entity that Being X had manipulated her into fighting against. She was totally screwed. Chapter 23. No prince, no avatar. Apparently, the only thing I do have is 5 traitors, and an incompetent subordinate who couldn't outsmart a lemur. Tanya looked down in shame. She had no excuses. Zhao had trusted her to capture the avatar, but she'd wasted the opportunity. If she'd just tried a little harder she could have captured the avatar before the solstice, and then Roku would have never showed up. The burning wreckage of the fire temple in the distance was a monument to her failure. But Commander. Rafik spoke up. Only Shu helped the avatar. Yet Zhao was in no mood to listen to reason. Save your stories for the Fire Lord. As far as I'm concerned, you are all guilty. He declared, gesturing for his nearby soldiers to apprehend them. Take them to the prison hold. No. Please. Rafik struggled against the soldiers, but was too old to force his way to freedom. As he and the other sages were dragged away he glanced over to Tanya, desperation in his eyes. You are one of us. A child of the fire temple. You know this is an injustice. Please, Captain Tanya, say something. Zhao's gaze bored into her, daring her to speak up in their defense. They weren't wrong, it was a clear injustice and an awful abuse of power, but Tanya knew how to read the room. She was so far from Zhao's good books that it wasn't funny, and if he sensed so much as a hint of disobedience from her at this moment she'd be joining them in the brig. No, Tanya was not such a selfless person as to risk her own freedom in an attempt to secure theirs. The best she could do was keep her head down, wait for this to all blow over, and then bring this issue up again after she'd done something meritorious enough to get back in the commander's good graces. When it became obvious Tanya wasn't going to say anything, Zhao sneered. That's what I thought. Take them away. As the fire sages were led away, Zhao turned his back on her to stare out towards the ocean, where the avatar's bison had been seen flying away into the horizon back towards the Earth Kingdom. For a moment a heavy silence hung between them, and Tanya resisted the urge to fidget uncomfortably. When Zhao finally spoke again, the sharpness of his tone made it clear that he was not in the mood for anything less than total obedience. Next time there can be no failure, Tanya. Am I clear? Yes, Commander. Tanya replied dutifully. You and I are birds of a feather, Tanya. We both seek positions worthy of our ambitions and intelligence. When the Fire Nation wins this war a new era will begin, and it will be people like you and I who will shape it. It was destiny that placed the Avatar in our path, so that we might be the ones to claim the glory for capturing him. Zhao clenched his fists. But if we should fail, the Fire Lord will hold us responsible, and he doesn't take kindly to failures. We cannot fail, Tanya. If we do, it will be the end of us. Do you understand? It was the sign of a bad workplace to punish someone for failing. Negligence, disrespect, or just plain stupidity should be met with consequences, but the act of failure itself could be a result of inexperience or just simple bad luck in many cases. How could any new employee grow into a competent asset if they were afraid to test their skills and knowledge by taking a risk every now and then? But it was too late to back out now. Tanya had been born into the Fire Nation, had sworn her loyalty to the Fire Lord, and was locked into whatever fate awaited her new homeland, whether that be good or terrible. As unreasonable as this demand was, what choice did she have but to obey? I do, Commander. Good. Zhao turned to face her, the anger in his eyes settling into a look of raw determination. The Avatar has won this battle, but the war isn't over yet. Not by a long shot. For hundreds of years, Fort Tenpi had served as a bastion of the Earth Kingdom, as immovable as the mountain it was hewn into. Built back during the war against Qin the Conqueror, the military outpost had allowed the land for miles around to be kept free of banditry. And now it stood in the Fire Nation's way. Earthbending soldiers manned the walls in full force, piles of heavy rocks at their sides as they observed the army of common soldiers amassed in a defensive formation before them. In the distance the rhythmic pounding of thousands of men marching in unison heralded the coming arrival of the Fire Nation army. Scouts had reported that they were outnumbered 2 to 1, but that didn't concern their commander. The Earth Kingdom was always better at fighting defensive battles, and with the fortifications of Tenpi to assist them he was confident that the Earth Kingdom would win this siege. The Fire Nation had made such headway into the Earth Kingdom because it used dishonorable tactics such as damming rivers, burning farmland, and other forms of sabotage to force the Earth Kingdom soldiers out of their defensive positions before engaging them. There had been no sign of such cheap tricks here though, which meant their commander must have arrogantly believed he could take them in a straight fight. The foolishness of the Fire Nation truly knew no bounds. It was as the first row of Fire Nation troops came into view, one of the watchmen up on the walls blew their horn in warning. The earthbenders manning the walls looked over to where he was pointing, and a chorus of fearful murmurs broke out across the troops as they spotted what had caused the alarm. High up in the night sky a pinprick of fast-moving light, like a shooting star, could be seen flying towards them. The devil of the South Sea was here. For the soldiers of the Earth Kingdom she was something of a boogeyman. Tales of her terrible deeds passed around in hushed, fearful tones during night watches. Though she had the appearance of a fairy-like little girl with hair the color of spun sunlight, her eyes glimmered like hot coals with the heat of a soul that blazed with lust for violence. They said she arrived to battle on a flying chariot made of hellfire, and devoured the spirits of those she slew to fuel her unnatural powers. If you said her name 3 times while looking at your reflection in the water she would appear behind you, and at night she roamed the woods like a wolf, hunting for deserters and feasting upon their cowardly livers. Nobody truly believed such tales, but that didn't stop the sense of trepidation that would hang in the air whenever someone mentioned her name. There were many fire-bending masters across the world, but none who were both so young nor so infamous for their acts of violence. As the fiery pinprick came close enough for the beginning of gold-colored hair to be made out, none of the earthbenders needed to wait for orders. As one they began firing the nearby rocks up towards her with the force of cannonballs, determined to remove the icon of dread before it could sap away at the morale of their soldiers. High up in the sky, Tanya felt a sharp-toothed grin spread across her lips as the hail of stones came her way. Gravity was already doing the brunt of the work for her, slowing the projectiles down and pulling many of them off course. While she was up here drawing the Earthbenders' fire, the vanguard of the Fire Nation army was just beginning to crash into the Earth Kingdom's front line without being pelted by an unrelenting hail or rock. Fear really could make even the most hardened soldiers act like novices. The flames spewing from her hands and feet grew brighter as she began to duck and weave erratically, swerving through the barrage of stone like a fly dodging clumsy hands. To the Earth Kingdom's credit, it didn't take the Earthbenders long to realize that their attention was misplaced. The barrage of stone grew lighter as more and more of them returned their attention to the battle below, and Tanya took the opportunity to press forwards. Projectiles came at her faster and more accurately as the distance between her and the earthbenders that still chose to target her closed, and after one boulder narrowly whizzed past her head Tanya decided it was time to strike back. A large fireball grew in the palm of one hand, and with a yell Tanya threw it down towards the wall. As the fireball traveled it split apart, breaking down into smaller-sized fireballs. One crashed harmlessly against the stone walls of Fort Tenpi, and another was blocked by an attentive soldier, but the other 4 struck earthbenders with enough force to knock them cleanly off their feet. A bright flash of light flared out from Tanya's feet as she pushed her propulsion technique to the maximum, rapidly accelerating towards the wall, until she was close enough to make out the terrified expression of the nearest soldier. Then the flames cut off abruptly as she flipped around, now falling towards the quickly approaching rampart's legs first as if intending to drop-kick it. Moments before a bone-shattering impact flames burst from her hands and feet again, not aiming to counter her momentum, but push her up into a horizontal line. Like a professional football player she slide-tackled along the ramparts at the speed of a racing car, waves of fire spewing in the wake as her armor grated and sparked against the stone floor. Each earthbender she passed was blasted off the ramparts and down into the chaotic melee below, crashing like heavy sacks upon the defensive formations of their own troops. Tanya's slide got her halfway along the ramparts before her momentum ran out, and with a spin that any break dancer would be envious of she sprang to her feet in a swirl of flames. It was impossible for the other earthbenders manning the walls to not have noticed her now, yet their own defensive position now worked against them. The narrow ramparts were only wide enough to allow about 3 people to pass by each other at once, and since she was now positioned at one end of their line, those on the other side could not fire at her without hitting each other in the back. Only 3 people could engage her at once, and only from the front. It was a massacre. Chapter 24. The narrow ramparts were only wide enough to allow about 3 people to pass by each other at once, and since she was now positioned at one end of their line, those on the other side could not fire at her without hitting each other in the back. Only 3 people could engage her at once, and only from the front. It was a massacre. Tanya moved like the demon she was nicknamed after, hacking and clawing away at them furiously with blades of flame. Where one earthbender fell, another was quick to take their place, but what did that matter when they were all too slow to get a proper attack in before Tanya's burning hands found them? Like a furious hurricane, Tanya tore through their ranks, claiming one new victim every second, until eventually there was nobody left to stop her. Gasping heavily for breath, Tanya pushed a lock of blonde hair out of her eyes and looked back at the now still ramparts behind her. The few earthbenders that hadn't been flung off it not lay unmoving. Down below, the Fire Nation soldiers issued a bellowing roar and surged forwards, emboldened by the strength of their captain and no longer hindered by a hail of rocks. Heavy tanks broke through the key parts of the Earth Army's formation, and with panicked cries the enemy's morale broke, their ranks scattering apart as soldiers turned and fled for their lives into the surrounding woods. One tank broke through the heavy gates, and like a tide of red and black the Fire Nation soldiers washed into Fort 10pi, eliminating any last shreds of resistance with quick and brutal blasts of fire. Tonight Fort 10pi would be pillaged, and tomorrow razed to the ground as the Fire Nation took their spoils of war back to the nearby Pahui stronghold. With Fort 10pi gone, the Fire Nation now had control of the Earth Kingdom settlements for miles around, all ready and waiting to be assimilated into the Fire Nation colonies. The Fire Lord would be pleased. And there was no doubting who would be credited with the victory. Tanya! 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 The soldiers below cheered as the final sparks of resistance were stomped out, signaling their complete and dominating victory. Spears were banged in rhythm against the ground, creating a drum-like tempo as the cheers turned into a resounding chant. It only grew louder as Tanya hopped up onto the edges of the rampart to get a better view of the scene below, her blonde hair whipping about wildly in the nighttime breeze. She hated fighting directly on the front lines like this, but Commander Zhao had needed any threats to the nearby Pahui stronghold dealt with before he could request the assistance of the Yuan archers in their hunt for the Avatar. A prize like this would finally be enough to sate the disappointment that had been lingering between them ever since her failure to capture the Avatar back at the Fire Temple. And if it helped secure the Yuan archers among their ranks at the same time, then all the better. Yes, with them at her side, her next encounter with the Avatar would not end quite the same way as it had last time. She would make sure of it. Absolutely not. The Yuan archers stay here. Your request is denied, Commander Zhao. Tanya could feel the beginnings of a headache coming on, and by the looks of things so could Zhao. It had been a day since she'd returned from the successful sacking of Fort 10pi, and she'd been delighted when Zhao had invited her to join him for his meeting with Colonel Shinu, the man in charge of Pahui stronghold. It was a sign that her past failures had indeed been forgiven, and he was willing to have her back at his side once more. Unfortunately, the meeting was not going as well as they'd hoped. Colonel Shinu, please reconsider. Zhao pleaded. Their precision is legendary. The Yuan can pin a fly to a tree from 100 yards away without killing it. You're wasting their talents using them as mere security guards. He wasn't wrong. The Yuan archers were one of the most highly trained non-bender units at the Fire Nation's disposal, and now that Fort 10pi was out of the way, their considerable skill would only be used to patrol the area. What threats were around here that required the skill of the Yuan archers? There was nothing around here besides a handful of small villages and some crazy herbalist lady in the mountains. I can do whatever I want with their talents, they're my archers, and what I say goes. Shinu stubbornly replied. Tanya would have groaned aloud at his childishness were she not the lowest ranked individual in the conversation. Instead she settled for just groaning in her head. She'd worked with managers who refused to loan out their skilled employees back in her first life, and it always boiled back down to the same reason: they just didn't want to share. Why give away your top assets to someone who'd be competing for the next big promotion alongside you after all? That selfish mindset stunted companies, and would stunt the Fire Nation military as well if left unchecked. Zhao was getting frustrated, so Tanya took that as her cue to try another line of reasoning. Colonel, the Avatar is a danger to us all. She interjected. The longer we leave him free to roam, the more powerful he will become. What happens if, 1 year from now, he comes here at the head of an Earth Kingdom army. Threats must be dealt with swiftly before they can grow into real problems. Your hunt for the Avatar is nothing but a vanity project. Shinu spat, before turning back to Zhao. We're fighting a real war here, and I need every man I've got, Commander. But that's final. I don't want to hear another word about it. Zhao was fuming at this point, and Tanya couldn't blame him. She'd very much like to deck this moron in the face herself. Real wars meant neutralizing the enemy's super weapons as soon as possible. Before Zhao could argue back, however, a squawk came from the sky, and all eyes turned to a messenger hawk as it swooped down and perched on Shinu's arm, presenting a missive tied to its leg. As Shinu read its contents, his expression became ever more grave. News from Fire Lord Oze. Zhao asked shrewdly, picking up on his change in mood. In response, Shinu gritted his teeth in frustration, and passed over the missive for Zhao to read. As his eyes scanned its contents, a pleased grin spread across Zhao's face. It appears I've been promoted to Admiral, he stated smugly. News about the successful destruction of Fort Tenpi must have reached the Fire Lord. My request is now in order. For a moment Shinu glared, but quickly realized that he could no longer win this battle of wits and bowed respectfully. As he turned to leave, Tanya bowed deeply to Zhao. Congratulations on your promotion, Admiral. Thank you, Tanya. Zhao replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. And with my promotion, I suppose that leaves my old position of commander empty. We can't have that now, can we? He smiled at her mischievously. Congratulations on your promotion too, Commander. Commander. He was promoting her. Tanya had been worried for a moment that her debacle at the Fire Temple might have ruined her chances, but on reflection it had been foolish to think that. Zhao was a fair man, his treatment of the fire sages notwithstanding, and had never yet failed to reward those who were competent and loyal. It was gratifying to know that he still wanted her at his side. Now she was just one step away from becoming an admiral herself, at which point a cushy office in a fancy mansion back at the homeland awaited her. Zhao might be honorable enough to lead from the front lines, but she personally would be more than happy to stay as safe and comfy as possible and direct her subordinates from afar. Listening in from the rooftop above, a figure clad all in black with a blue mask clenched his fists, before disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 25. Literally the next day Zhao's decision to take command of the Yuan archers was vindicated. The Avatar, for whatever reason, had been spotted running up the mountain towards the herbalists. His timing could not have been better. The Yuan archers had been dispatched to apprehend him, and to say that they had done an amazing job was an understatement. They had gone above and beyond the call of duty, literally jumping off a cliff in their pursuit, and had successfully captured him unharmed. The moment the Avatar had been dragged back to Pahuai stronghold, he'd been chained up in the main interrogation cell, and a messenger had informed Zhao and Tanya. Which was how Tanya now found herself following along at Zhao's heels as they made their way there. Zhao practically oozed satisfaction, his grin never slipping for even a second as they traversed the metal hallways. This is destiny, Tanya. Destiny. He repeated for what must be the 5th time now. Agni has placed the Avatar in our path so that we might capture him and earn what we are owed. He wasn't wrong, capturing the Avatar was all but guaranteed to make them heroes of the Fire Nation. Perhaps they'd even be promoted again on the spot? That would make Tanya the youngest admiral in Fire Nation history. More importantly, however, an Avatar that was locked away in the dungeons couldn't learn to master the elements, and would never be able to threaten her as being ex-intended. All they had to do now was transport him back to the Fire Nation and her every problem would be solved. When they finally reached the cell, Zhao opened the door and led the way inside. The room was fairly large, but bare of all furnishings besides 2 burning braziers and 2 pillars to which heavy chains were fashioned. Stuck in the middle of them stood the Avatar, small and meek compared to the thick restraints used to bind him. So this is the great Avatar. Zhao sneered, circling around the captive boy. Master of all the elements. I don't know how you've managed to elude the Fire Nation for 100 years, but your little game of hide and seek is over. The Avatar looked up angrily. I've never hidden from you. Untie me and I'll fight you right now. No. Zhao came to a stop in front of the Avatar's face. Tell me, how does it feel to be the only airbender left? Do you miss your people? A look of hurt crossed the Avatar's face, and for a second Tanya felt a shred of sympathy for the boy. Not only was he the sole survivor of a genocide, but had only found out about it decades after it had happened. Quickly she clamped down on and buried that feeling. Now was not the time to empathize with the enemy. If Zhao had felt any sympathy, however, he didn't show it. "Don't worry, you won't be killed like they were," he continued, deliberately ignoring the Avatar's glare. "See, if you die you will just be reborn and the Fire Nation would have to start searching all over again. So I'll keep you alive, but just barely." The Avatar took a deep breath, and before Tanya could react blew a gale force wind at Zhao, knocking him over. His grin replaced with a scowl, Zhao picked himself up and glared at the boy. "Blow all the wind you want, but your situation is futile. There is no escaping this fortress, and no one is coming to rescue you," he snapped. "Tanya, make sure our guest is comfortable." With that he stormed out, leaving Tanya alone with the Avatar. Now that he wasn't riding a flying hairy cow or leaping around the room, she could finally get a proper look at the one being X has chosen to pit her against. He didn't look like much, small and gangly, really no more than a boy, yet some part of Tanya's mind could not help but overshadow him with the image of Roku, a premonition of what he would one day grow up to be. She also couldn't help notice that he smelled faintly like frogs for some reason. When it became clear that she wasn't planning to say anything, the Avatar spoke up to fill the silence. "Not going to gloat as well?" "No," Tanya replied disinterestedly. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't going to turn into Roku again and bring this stronghold crashing down on my head." It surprised her when the Avatar actually had the decency to look a little sheepish. "Sorry about that. I never wanted to hurt you, I just didn't feel like I had a choice." Tanya hummed dismissively, and began pacing around the Avatar slowly. "It's all right, I don't hold it against you. This is war after all, we all must do whatever we have to survive, no matter how uncivilized." "You sound like you don't approve of the war," the Avatar replied curiously. "That's because I don't. It's a senseless waste of human resources." "Then why support it?" the Avatar asked passionately. "This whole war is pointless. Nobody would have to suffer anymore if we all agreed to put our weapons down and just talk to each other." Tanya chuckled. Of course, the Avatar was still just a child, clinging to a naive view of the world. "If only diplomacy was enough to bring an end to this war," she said wistfully. "Personally I would like nothing more than to settle our nation's disputes with words. But how many people are alive right now who remember a time when the world wasn't at war? 10? 20? For 100 years both sides have spilled blood in the name of their nation, and wept for the sons and daughters they sent to the front lines who never returned. Do you think all that hatred can be brushed aside with just a few words?" "I'm not saying it would be easy," the Avatar replied. "I know how it feels to lose your family to war. But as long as people cling to that hatred, the suffering will just continue for everyone. If the Fire Nation surrenders we can all turn our attention to reconciliation and healing." "Oh? Only if the Fire Nation surrenders?" Tanya asked. "Well, yeah, you are the bad guys after all." A guffaw slipped out of Tanya's lips before she could stop herself, and she flushed a little at the unseemly sound before regaining her composure. "We're the bad guys, are we? I mean, you are the ones who started this war. So would we not also have peace if the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribes surrendered? Would there be a war if the Fire Nation had nobody left to wage war against?" The Avatar had no answer to that, staring at her blankly as he considered that other point of view for what was likely the first time. "There are no good or bad guys in war, Avatar," Tanya reprimanded. "Look at Qin the Conqueror. Or any of the warlords that came before him. Worldwide unification is inevitable, whether then be at the hands of the Fire Nation, Earth Kingdom, or even the Water Tribes. Wars will always break out once a population becomes large enough that it is forced to expand its borders, and will keep occurring until one day this world is successfully united beneath one government, leaving nobody left to fight against." She stopped her circling in front of the Avatar. "The Fire Nation offers technology no other nation can compete with. All would share in our prosperity and scientific knowledge, and it's not like we would treat the colonies badly. Unhappy workers are unproductive workers after all. The idea that our world must remain divided between 4 nations is an outdated concept. Imagine, Avatar, what the work would be like if the Fire Nation was victorious. It would be a world of progress. A world without border disputes or petty international politics. A world with no wars left to wage." The Avatar was silent for a moment. Then, in a surprisingly calm voice, he spoke. "A world with nobody to stop the Fire Lord from doing whatever they wanted. That was true. Upon winning the war, the Fire Lord would be the absolute ruler of the world, an unopposed dictator who could decide the laws of every nation without fear of consequences. Tanya trusted Oze, Azula, and to an extent Zuko to be benevolent dictators, but as the old saying went, absolute power corrupted absolutely. Who was to say that the descendants of Oze's bloodline 100 years from now would be as disciplined? Realizing that her prolonged silence was proving the Avatar's point, she struggled to quickly come up with a clever reply. How naive, Avatar, if you think. Aang. What? Chapter 26. Realizing that her prolonged silence was proving the Avatar's point, she struggled to quickly come up with a clever reply. How naive, Avatar, if you think. Aang. What? The Avatar looked up, directly into her eyes, and for a moment Tanya was stunned by the flickers of wisdom she could see within them. You keep calling me Avatar. But that's not my name. It's Aang. She knew that. Zuko had mentioned it during his questioning that day he'd limped into Zhao's port, and Tanya would never forget information about such an important enemy in case it ever provided her with an advantage over them. Yet now that she thought about it, even in her head she only referred to the Avatar by his title. Calling him by his title was a reminder of his power, his history, and the threat he presented to her nation. Calling him by his real name was a reminder that he was human too. No. Tanya shook her head, trying to physically dispel the thought from her mind. This wasn't how the conversation had been supposed to go. He was playing mind games with her, trying to undermine her commitment to the cause her entire life depended on. She took a step backwards, scowling as she realized that her best option was to cut this conversation short and just leave. Yet as she turned her back and stormed away, Aang's voice rang out one more time. What's your name? Tanya froze at the door, unsure why she found herself affected by such a simple question. What would he do with that information? Put a price on her head? Send Earth Kingdom assassins after her? Try some spiritual witchcraft to steal her identity? No, she was being ridiculous. It was a simple question, and refusing to answer it would be a sign of cowardice. Tanya. She said simply, not turning back to face him. A second later she pulled open the door and, without another word, disappeared down the hallway. Aang watched her go, continuing to stare at the door even as it slammed shut behind her. Even since he'd been awakened from the ice, a part of him had been curious about the Fire Nation's perspective on this whole war. It seemed alien to him how an entire nation could believe that the war was something that should be continued despite all the pain that fighting it had caused them. It was gratifying in some way to get confirmation that they hadn't all just turned into cold-hearted killers overnight, they were just being led astray by a few evil people in position of power. If he could bring an end to this war there was still a chance that the Fire Nation he'd once known, the one that had produced his best friend Kuzan, could be reborn once again. Sleep would not come easily to Tanya. It wasn't that she was doubting her loyalty to the Fire Lord, but Aang's words were enough to make her ponder the ramifications of the Fire Nation winning the war from a broader perspective. And something about the tone of the speech Zhao had delivered to the soldiers moments ago, a prediction that this would be the year the Fire Nation burnt Ba Sing Se to the ground, struck a wrong chord with her. The Fire Lord being an unelected dictator was something she hadn't really thought about before, as monarchies were a common political structure seen during the equivalent of this time period in her original world as well. However, even after living two very different lifetimes, she had never before caught a hint as to what would happen if one dictator gained control over the entire planet. She turned over and buried her face into a pillow, seeing if that wouldn't suffocate the unwanted doubts. This was absurd. Why should she care if some dictator another 100 years in the future proved unworthy of their power? There were flaws in any political system, and by that time she'd be long gone. The next couple of generations could wage their own civil wars if that was a problem. All she should have to worry about was surviving the war she'd been forced into. Suddenly the ringing of alarm bells chimed loudly around the stronghold, causing Tanya to sit up, wide-eyed and alert in an instant. An emergency now. This had to be on. The Avatar's doing. It was too much of a coincidence to think otherwise. Within the minute her uniform had been thrown on and she was halfway out of the door, rushing in the direction she could hear the most commotion coming from. It did not take long to find the source. She had to hand it to him, Aang was gutsier than he first appeared. That or he was insane enough to honestly think that using airbending to throw his own friend at high speed towards a wall was a good idea. Speaking of which, he must also be more cunning than he appeared, because the black-clad figure in the blue mask assisting him in his escape was most certainly a covert agent of some kind. An assassin perhaps, if the skill with which he wielded those dual swords was anything to go by. It had been clever to keep this mysterious companion of his hidden for a moment he was really needed. The man in the blue mask successfully landed atop the innermost wall, and Aang was quick to follow with his own air-powered leap. A second later flames blossomed from Tanya's feet as she propelled herself into the sky as well, shooting through the night sky like a shooting star. If the Avatar really thought that he was the master of the skies around here, then he was in for a rude awakening. Spinning a spear pole above his head like a helicopter and grappling blue mask between his legs, the Avatar had almost reached the middle of Pahui Stronghold's 3 walls before Tanya was in effective firing range. She decided to announce her presence by spewing a white fan of flames out of both hands, aiming to completely envelop both targets and burn them enough to shut down this escape attempt without killing them. It was her misfortune that, in the dark of the night, such a spread-out wave of fire generated a lot of light. No sooner had it left her hands than Blue Mask noticed, and tapped the Avatar's foot to get his attention. As the attack was about to crash upon them, Aang twisted and spun his pole to create a shield of air, protecting him and his accomplice even as the force of the attack pushed them the rest of the way towards the middle wall. As they hit the top of the wall and skipped across the dusty stone like tumbleweeds, Tanya's hard-won battle instincts screamed that now was the time to finish them off while they were down. However, Zhao had already made it clear that he wanted the Avatar alive, and if this Blue Mask agent was an operative of another nation, he was sure to know some useful intelligence. A different approach was needed here. Whilst the soldiers atop the wall engaged Aang and Blue Mask, Tanya changed course and touched down daintily a few feet away, patiently waiting for the melee to finish. She crossed her arms and leaned against the brickwork, content to watch for the moment as the two would-be escapees fought. Besides a whole lot jumping around back at the fire temple, Tanya hadn't seen any air-bending forms before. Watching a master, albeit a young one, fight was an informative experience. After his makeshift staff was kicked away early on in the brawl, Aang switched to an unarmed style that mostly incorporated open-palmed strikes to throw enemies around the battlefield, and lots of light, agile motions that allowed him to quickly spin away at the first hint of an incoming attack. He was always on his toes, letting his enemies unbalance themselves with their clumsy attacks and only then providing the final gentle push needed to take them out of the fight. Blue Mask, however, was far from non-violent. He fought like a machine, a constant whirlwind of motion that aimed to cause the greatest effect with the least amount of effort. It was efficiency in motion, a form that was fluid, powerful, and honed to a razor-fine point. Headhunters would be salivating if a guy like this walked into a recruitment office back in her first world. This individual must have received high-quality professional training for years to obtain such a level of skill. Before long the melee was over, the fire soldiers having been tossed around like rag dolls. She was going to have to draw up a stricter training regimen when she was done here. Down below she could see more soldiers approaching with siege ladders, but before they could set foot on the wall, Tanya raised a finger and sent a spark of sizzling flame, like a firework, up into the sky. All at once the soldiers froze wherever they were, watching silently with rapt attention. Chapter 27. Down below she could see more soldiers approaching with siege ladders, but before they could set foot on the wall, Tanya raised a finger and sent a spark of sizzling flame, like a firework, up into the sky. All at once the soldiers froze wherever they were, watching silently with rapt attention. The fire-bending style the sages had taught her back when she was a child was a variation designed for ceremonies. It traded efficiency and damage for spectacle and control, using displays of flashing lights and finely honed flames to awe an audience rather than annihilate an enemy. Tanya had long since streamlined the style back into something more combat effective for her own use, yet a handful of techniques she'd never altered were the ones designed to produce a variety of firework-like flares. At the beginning she'd used them as decoys and distractions when under attack whilst flying, but as Zhao rapidly entrusted her with higher and higher positions of command, she'd soon adapted them for another use. Each unique flare had a message known only to soldiers under Zhao's command: backup required, advance on this position, retreat. The list was about 30 pages long by now, and each flare allowed her to give quick order to all her soldiers that could see the sky for miles around without having to waste time writing message or shout over the roar of combat. In a world that had yet to invent the telephone, her ability to adapt her orders so quickly in response to problems was invaluable. And the flare she had just sent up was one of the earliest she'd ever drilled into her soldiers' heads. Hold your position. Sensing the shift in atmosphere, Aang and Blue Mask turned to face her, ready and waiting in their fighting stances. Tanya smirked, and with a mocking air of indifference sauntered towards them. I'm impressed. She called out casually, making a show of checking her nails. Can't say I've ever heard of two people trying to fight an entire stronghold. Your courage is commendable. Commendable enough for you to let us go? Aang asked hopefully, though the way he stayed firm and ready in his stance made it clear what he suspected the answer would be. Tanya's only answer was to let a grin settle across her face and sink into her own fighting stance. A second passed, then 2, then 3. It seemed like they were happy to wait for the first move. Tanya's grin only widened. Never let a firebender strike first. One moment she was completely still, and the next she crossed half the distance between them, sweeping forwards with both arms to unleash 2 huge wings of flames that spread out to the left and right and then closed in on the duo, enveloping them from every direction. The avatar twirled, beckoning a mild hurricane around himself and his ally that dissipated the flames into a sea of sparks. Yet as the sparks faded, Tanya was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, along the side of the wall, Tanya ran as quickly and quietly as she could manage without her feet slipping. Her left hand was pointed down towards the ground, creating enough jet propulsion to counteract the gravitational force acting upon her and thus run alongside the wall without falling. Once was behind the avatar's position, she turned to face upwards, throwing back her other hand with a second jet boost, and sprinted straight back up the wall. Neither target saw it coming as she suddenly skipped over the wall behind them, briefly flipping in the air and shooting out a bolt of fire at Blue Mask's unguarded back before she landed. Blue Mask had good instincts, and rolled forward with the blow as it struck between his shoulder blades. It mitigated the damage somewhat, but nowhere near enough to prevent a nasty burn. However, Tanya did not care, as before the bolt had even hit Blue Mask she had turned to Aang and unleashed a constant stream of fire at him. The avatar, having had a little more time, was able to hop to the side to avoid it, and scrambled into a panicked run as Tanya twisted towards him, rotating at the hips to bring her jet of flames chasing at Aang's heels. Yet Blue Mask refused to stay out of the fight for long, and rushed back over to attack, forcing her to end her fire stream in order to defend herself. Twin swords rushed down towards her torso in a powerful cross slash, which Tanya intercepted early with the elbow plates of her armor. She kicked out, foot wrapped in flames, at Blue Mask's stomach to force him to back away. Yet to her surprise, Blue Mask did not back away. He tanked the kick, ignoring the flames licking at his stomach apparently through sheer force of will, and grabbed Tanya's leg by the shin. Tanya yelped in shock as she suddenly found herself dragged up and over Blue Mask's head and slammed bodily into the ground on the other side of him. It was both painful and humiliating. Before Blue Mask could repeat the maneuver she kicked out with her other leg, the blast of fire she unleashed this time far more intense, and forced Blue Mask to let go and dodge or risk having a hole incinerated through his chest. She spun, beginning a technique designed to send a wave of fire across the ground to burn her enemy's feet, when a wall of intense wind shot out around Blue Mask's side and struck her, doing little in the way of direct damage but easily picking her up and sending her tumbling uncontrollably along the ramparts. For a good 10 seconds her world consisted solely of a series of sickening spins, shapes and colors swirling rapidly past her eyes, and sharp bumps as she rolled uncomfortably across the stone floor. When at last the wind lost enough force to relinquish its grip on her, Tanya was sprawled out of her back, her hair a wild mess and her eyes spinning with dizziness. A deep groan escaped her lips, not one of pain, but of frustration at realizing an unfortunate truth. She was weak against airbending. The issue lay with the body being X had foisted upon her. It was small, naturally delicate, and very, very light. In a world without magic, bending or any other supernatural powers, it would have been a terrible body for any would-be warrior to be born with, as it meant that Tanya had to maintain a rigorous strength training routine to be able to punch just as hard as your average civilian. Fortunately, in both of the supernatural worlds she'd been incarnated into, Tanya had been able to rely on her huge reserves of magic power to deal damage for her, and use her small body to her advantage by nimbly dodging most attacks. Against earthbenders her body was perfect. Earthbending was the naturally slowest form of ending, favoring sturdy defenses that would not crumble easily over quicker, flimsier alternatives. Against earthbenders she could easily dart her way across the battlefield, avoiding their attacks and bypassing their defenses, then hit them hard from an exposed angle. She was average against other firebenders, and waterbenders too she suspected, who struck a balance between speed and power. But airbending, thanks to the pacifist ideals that shaped it, focused on speed rather than dealing direct damage. It was a difficult style to dodge unless you were an airbender yourself, and Tanya's light body made it far easier for each gust of pick her up and throw her around like a dog's chew toy. Great! I'm weak to a style literally known by only one person in the entire world, and that's the guy I get tasked with capturing. As the world slowly stopped inconsiderately wobbling around her, Tanya sat up in time to watch Aang and Blue Mask leap off the wall again, using one wooden siege ladder like a giant pole vault, then switching to another as the first reached the height of its arc, as if walking on a set of gigantic stilts. It was a ridiculous idea, so outlandish only a madman would think of it, and yet by some miracle it almost worked. The escapees' hands just brushed against the final outer wall before they fell down to the gate. They haven't escaped yet. There's still time. Before she'd even consciously thought about it, Tanya had taken to the skies again, and if she wobbled ever so slightly, none of the soldiers were brave enough to mention it. Outside the final gate, Blue Mask and the Avatar fought a small horde of encircling soldiers, slicing and breaking the wall of spears that tried to surround them one by one. Building a large fireball in one hand, Tanya chucked it towards the Avatar like a grenade, gambling that the unexpected attack from above would catch them by surprise. Yet Blue Mask's warrior instincts seemed sharp enough to sense something was amiss, for no sooner had the fireball left her grasp than his obscured face flicked up to look at it. He jumped, vaulted off the shoulder of a nearby soldier for extra height, and as the fireball approached he used the flat of his blade like a tennis racket to bat the projectile at the gate. Flames exploded against the gate, fortunately not blasting them open but spooking the nearby soldiers into taking a step back. Tanya landed hard, eschewing grace for intimidation factor as she bent at the knees and slammed a fist into the ground, emitting a small flare of sparks in time with her impact. A tense, reverent silence settled over the soldiers again as they sensed their commander's foul mood, and without needing an order they shifted slightly to form a ring of spears, trapping the Avatar and Blue Mask in a makeshift arena with her. Slowly Tanya stood up, fixing her golden eyes upon the convicts with a look of such fury that the Avatar gulped nervously. "Okay, I'm done being impressed," she hissed, settling back into her fighting stance. The ring of soldiers around them flinched back nervously. "Now I'm pissed." She lunged forward with one hand, fingers extended out like talons, and scraped them ferally through the air. From each fingertip a thin but intense whip of fire lashed forwards, screeching through the air towards the Avatar like a flying tiger claws. Aang yelped and leaned backwards like a limbo dancer, allowing the flying slices to pass so closely over his head that they evaporated, a bead of sweat dripping down it, and watched in terror as they struck the gates and carved gashes as deep as axe swings into the wood. Tanya struck out again with her other hand, then again, and again, until her arms were a frenzied blur of slashes. Aang and Blue Mask ducked, dodged, and weaved like dancers, taking a few scrapes here and there but otherwise doing a remarkably good job of evading. When it became clear that Tanya had no intention of relenting and that they couldn't keep dodging forever, Aang dropped low and spun around, sending a wave of wind to knock Tanya off her feet. If dodging airbending was a problem, then she'd just force her way through. With an axe kick wreathed in flames she split the oncoming gust in two, then spun around and unleashed her own wave of fire across the ground in retaliation. Aang and Blue Mask jumped to avoid it, yet while their feet were off the ground Tanya quickly double-jabbed, sending two quick bolts of fire to strike them each in the chest. Chapter 28. If dodging airbending was a problem, then she'd just force her way through. With an axe kick wreathed in flames she split the oncoming gust in two, then spun around and unleashed her own wave of fire across the ground in retaliation. Aang and Blue Mask jumped to avoid it, yet while their feet were off the ground Tanya quickly double-jabbed, sending two quick bolts of fire to strike them each in the chest. Aang took the hit badly and fell onto his back, but Blue Mask seemed to brush it off easily enough and charged her with his blades at the ready. Now it was Tanya's turn to duck, weave and dodge as she snaked her way through the onslaught of steel. Yet as skilled as Blue Mask was, Tanya was skilled, livid, and could breathe fire, and slowly but surely her dodges became laced with more and more counterattacks, until before long she was the one pressing the attack and Blue Mask was giving ground. Suddenly Blue Mask swayed to the side, revealing the powerful blast of air that Aang had been gathering behind his back and had just unleashed in Tanya's direction. But Tanya had seen this trick before, and no tactician worth their salt took a hit like she had before without developing a counter for it as soon as possible. Tanya's foot shot out like a snake, hooking Blue Mask's ankle as he tried to get out of the way. Mid-sway, the masked man was off balance, and with her own footing secure Tanya was able to drag him back into the air blast's path, using him as a shield. Realizing that he was about to hit his only ally, Aang threw his hands up and forcibly redirected the powerful gale upwards at the last second, lifting Blue Mask up into the air rather than pushing him into the awaiting sea of spears surrounding them. Ever prepared to take advantage of an enemy's weakness, Tanya spotted her golden opportunity. Blue Mask was out of the fight for a few seconds, and the Avatar had lost his footing from his own rushed redirection. She darted forward, extending one arm with a single finger pointing toward the Avatar like an arrow tip. From that finger burst a tiny flame no bigger than the tip of a pencil, but containing fire condensed so tightly that the heat of it could melt through a few inches of solid metal. She would pierce a hole through the airbender's stomach, not big enough to kill him, but enough to cause such crippling pain that he wouldn't be standing up for weeks. With her speed enhanced by jets of flame from her feet, Tanya was in front of the avatar in the blink of an eye. Aang's footwork left him no opportunity to dodge, and he could only watch in horror as the superheated finger closed in on him. Tanya grinned wickedly. Checkmate. Nobody would have to suffer any more if we all agreed to put our weapons down and just talk to each other. Tanya froze, finger a mere centimeter from the avatar's flesh. Aang stared back at her, frozen by fear and the tense silence. In all honesty, Tanya wasn't entirely sure herself why she had hesitated. She had never hesitated to inflict much worse injuries than this in any life she'd lived. So why then did her instincts tell her that she didn't need to do this? It's unnecessary violence. The avatar is completely surrounded and knows that he's been beaten. Anything more than this would just be cruelty for cruelty's sake. Tanya knew she could be cruel in an efficient, ruthless way. She was the sort of person who deliberately stationed soldiers she disapproved of to defend locations she knew were about to be attacked by forces they could hope to defend against. But that cruelty had always been in the name of fighting for her country, not in the service of her own personal pleasure. Yield! She hissed icily, glaring at Aang. The nomad nodded silently in acceptance, and Tanya slowly drew her finger away and extinguished the flame upon it. Take him back to his cell. Double the guard around him. She ordered the surrounding soldiers, and when the sound of someone hitting the ground hard next to her revealed that Blue Mask had returned to Earth, she nodded her head in his direction. And take this one to a cell too. Aang slumped his head in defeat as the surrounding soldiers cautiously advanced, and Tanya turned her back, ignoring the faint trace of guilt she felt settle in her stomach. She was just in time to see Zhao push his way through the crowd, ready to retake control of the situation. He looked pleased, smug even, as he regarded the downbeat nomad. Excellent work, Tanya. He all but purred, reaching out to pat her shoulder in a fatherly fashion as she came to stand beside him. I knew my faith in you would be rewarded. Is he dead? Colonel Shinu, who had just succeeded in pushing his own way through the crowd, asked. No. Tanya replied, turning to face Zhao. Captured alive, just like you wanted. Suddenly the ringing of steel and cries of surprise caught their attention, and in unison both the admiral and commander whipped their heads back around to spot the cause. Blue Mask had been able to shrug off the soldiers that came to arrest him and darted towards the avatar. But not to protect him. The sharp blades of the twin swords now rested against the avatar's neck, an unspoken promise of blood about to be spilled. Some of the soldiers made to attack, but with a gesture Zhao commanded them to stop. He knows we want the avatar alive. Tanya thought. He's using him as a hostage. But was he bluffing, or serious? Without a face and eyes to look at, Tanya found herself unsure. At first glance it seemed ridiculous that a man who'd nearly succeeded in breaking the avatar out of a heavily guarded stronghold would then execute the one he'd worked so hard to liberate. Then again, his skill at stealth and swordsmanship suggested some level of intelligence service training. A captured avatar would not be able to aid the war effort again until he died of old age, which considering Aang's youth might be another 100 years. Kill him however, and he would be reborn in the water tribes, able to be raised and trained to fight again in about 10 years. Sure, he'd likely never find an airbending teacher, but better an avatar with 3 elements than one with none. For a moment the tense silence lingered, both sides watching and waiting for the other to make a mistake. Eventually it was Zhao who spoke first. Open the gate. He growled through gritted teeth. Admiral, what are you doing? Shinu asked. Let them out, now. Zhao demanded, his tone making it clear that heads would roll if he had to say it again. Slowly, reluctantly, the soldiers manning the gates got to work, and inch by inch the heavy door of the stronghold creaked open. The moment it was wide enough, Blue Mask began walking backwards through them, taking his hostage with him. How could you let them go? Shinu hissed. Tanya shot the colonel a dirty look, about to sarcastically ask what he'd do differently in such a situation, but was beaten to it by Zhao, whose expression was strangely calm. A situation like this requires precision. Without explaining himself, he turned and began to walk to the stairs leading to the top of the wall. Confused, Tanya and Shinu glared briefly at each other before following. Do you have a clear shot? The Yuan archer did not reply verbally to Zhao's question, but the way he tensed his arms seemed to be a silent gesture of confirmation. Blue Mask was still within arrow range, and had yet to release his threatening hold on Aang, assuming that from such a distance any attack would present too much risk of hitting the avatar. Clearly he'd never seen the skill of the Yuan archers himself. But Tanya had. She stood tense at the edge of the walls, ready to take to the air at a moment's notice. Knock out the thief. I'll deliver him to the Fire Lord along with the Avatar. Zhao commanded. A second later the arrow flew, soaring through the sky with the swiftness of a bird. A wooden crack resounded through the air as the projectile struck true, and as Blue Mask fell backwards, fire roared from Tanya's feet as she rocketed towards them like a bloodhound. Yet she wasn't the only one who could bend. As Blue Mask hit the ground, Aang waved his hands, and a gust of wind kicked up a wide cloud of dust that concealed the surrounding area. It only took a few seconds for Tanya to arrive, and when she did, a wide blast of fire dispelled the cloud of dust. But no sign of the Avatar, or his accomplice, remained. The other soldiers arrived shortly after and fanned out, hunting for any sign to suggest which way they'd fled. But airbenders knew better than anyone how to escape, and something in her gut told her that they wouldn't find hide nor hair of Blue Mask either. Tanya turned back to the stronghold just in time to see Zhao glare at her in disapproval and turn away. She'd failed to capture the Avatar. Again. Chapter 29. What makes our nation great? It had been an hour since the Avatar's escape, and on Zhao's command all soldiers had gathered in the main courtyard, where a wooden stage had been hastily set up. In neat uniform rows the soldiers stood at attention, each wearing their full armor and helmets so that, from where she stood beside Zhao on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, they seemed to Tanya like an army of identical, faceless pawns arranged on a chessboard. Zhao had not shared with her what the purpose of this assembly was. In fact, he'd barely said a word except to set this gathering up. Truth be told, it worried her. Zhao was the type to rant and rave when he was angry, then move on when he got it all out of his system. This unusual behavior was making her nervous. Is it that we are stronger than our fellow men? That we are braver? More intelligent? Zhao continued. Many would say yes, and I would not disagree with them. But what is the reason that we possess these qualities, while the other inferior nations do not? Is it because of blood? Because the spirits smile upon us? He slammed a hand down on the balcony railings, creating a metallic ringing that resounded across the courtyard. No. It is because we see a truth that the other nations refuse to accept. That we are part of something bigger than ourselves. While the other nations feud between their petty tribes and kingdoms, grasping for their own personal satisfaction, we alone stand united under the guiding hand of the Fire Lord. Every one of us, from the humblest farmer to the richest noble, freely gives the fruits of our labor, not for personal gain, but as a contribution to the greater good of our nation. That is why we succeed. Because we offer our skills, our service, even our very lives, to something bigger. And one day, when all corners of our world are united beneath the Fire Lord's loving rule, we shall all share in the rewards of a world without conflict. Our utopia. The soldiers below erupted into roars of approval, and Tanya found herself clapping along with them. Zhao could be a very charismatic leader when he was in the right frame of mind. Zhao made a gesture, and the cheers of the soldiers slowly shifted into murmurs of confusion as Zhao's personal guard walked out from the fort, dragging with them figures in tatty brown robes with sacks over their heads and ropes binding their wrists. The guards stepped onto the wooden platform and began tying the captives' hands to the wooden platform. But there are some within our nation who possess rotten hearts. Who eat the fruit of others' labor and contribute nothing themselves. They are parasites in the skin of men, thieves, cowards, and traitors. Zhao continued, his voice taking on a graver tone. They fester in every dark nook of our nation, every shadow cast by the Fire Lord's light. They might be the urchin who begs for your money, the colonial who works in your shop, even. He glanced back at Tanya for a split second, his eyes wide and dark with suspicion. The soldier you trust to watch your back. Down below, Zhao's guards ripped the sacks off the prisoners' heads, and Tanya let out an involuntary gasp as she recognized them. The sages Zhao had arrested back at the fire temple. And not just them, but the 4 soldiers she'd assigned to stand guard outside the Avatar's cell. All were gagged and fearful, tugging unsuccessfully at the ropes as Zhao's guards stepped off the platform. Zhao turned back to the crowd. Those you see before you are such traitors. The fire sages, who aided the Avatar in contacting the spirit of his past self. And the soldiers who, through their idleness, allowed a single man in a mask to free the Avatar and abscond from this very stronghold. Because of them, the Avatar remains at large. Because of them, a threat to our beloved Fire Lord walks free, gaining more and more power with each day that passes. Their selfishness had robbed the rest of us of the rewards we all struggled together to achieve. And how shall we deal with this treachery? Should we forgive them? Welcome them back into our fold, knowing that they will continue to feast upon our hard work? No. He raised an arm, and down below his guards settled into fire-bending stances. We shall remove them. Zhao dropped his hand, and all at once his guards punched, launching streams of flames at the wooden platform. In mere seconds the wood caught alight, and the prisoners' screams of fear turned into howls of agony. Admiral! Stop this! Tanya hissed urgently, mind racing to come up with a way to stop what was undoubtedly a war crime. And one committed against their nation's own people no less. But Zhao ignored her. Let this be a reminder to all of you. He roared, voice carrying easily across the crackling of the flames and the dying wails of the prisoners. To fail the Fire Nation is to betray the Fire Nation. And this is how the Fire Nation deals with traitors. As if to highlight his point, the screams of the prisoners trailed off with pitiful, gasping whimpers, leaving not a sound besides the hiss of the flames to carry across the fearfully hushed courtyard. Zhao turned around and made to leave, but stopped as he passed Tanya and put a hand on her shoulder, leaning down to whisper in her ear. Twice now you have had the Avatar in the palm of your hand. And twice now you have let him escape. I would think you incompetent, had I not personally seen you level ships, raise fortresses, and massacre enemies by the dozens. So I ask myself why, despite your power, one peace-loving 10-year-old continues to evade you. Zhao's eyes flashed dangerously in the firelight. One would almost think your heart wasn't in it. For the first time since she'd met him, Tanya felt a tinge of fear writhe in her stomach as Zhao's eyes bored into hers. She'd known that Zhao could be vicious, even downright bloodthirsty, but had only ever seen it directed at the enemy before. Now she felt it turned upon her, and as if a curtain within her mind had been drawn back, she realized the truth. Zhao did not see her as a protégé, nor a friend, nor even as a comrade with a shared dream. He saw her as a weapon. His favor was reliant upon her achieving results he could bring before the Fire Lord. And if she proved incapable of providing them, he would dispose of her. Zhao stood up straight once again. I am generous to have allowed your 2 previous failures to go unpunished. But the next time we find the Avatar and you fail to capture him, it will be you standing on that platform. He said, as casually as if discussing the weather, then continued to walk back into the stronghold. 3rd time's the charm, right? I hope it is anyway. For your sake. Chapter 30. Tanya had a serious problem on her hands. In some ways things between her and Zhao had not changed at all. Their day-to-day routine remained the same. He presented her with a mission that would free up nearby troops for reassignment, and she executed it flawlessly and without mercy. Every week missives were sent back to the homeland detailing their unbroken string of victories, and as a reward Zhao's claims to the troops they freed up were approved. Yet in other ways things were completely different. No longer did Zhao pretend to be anything other than the ambitious, demanding taskmaster he truly was, and in turn Tanya showed all the emotion of a robot when in his presence. Their office culture had burned away in the flames of the execution platform, leaving only a cold, clinical relationship. Tanya did not believe that Zhao had been bluffing when he threatened her with death. Despite the fact that she was perhaps one of the most skilled firebenders in the world, Zhao's pride would not let him back out of a threat he'd made. He would see it through if only to prove that he wasn't afraid to. This was, of course, a problem, as Tanya had no intention of dying by his hands or anyone else's. There was no denying, however, that the sword of Damocles was dangling perilously above her head. There were precious few choices she could make that didn't place her in mortal peril. Request a transfer, and Zhao would no doubt deny it and then send her on a suicide mission. Leave the military altogether, and she'd be hunted down by the Fire Nation as a traitor, unable to take refuge within the other nations thanks to having slaughtered so many of their troops. Stay, and whenever the Avatar next showed up she'd be executed if she didn't manage to catch the slippery bastard, which was not a gamble she was comfortable taking given her current track record. If only she'd been more hesitant to trust Zhao right from the beginning. If she'd been able to establish her own method of communicating with the homeland outside of military channels, she could have contacted Azula, and pulled on her connections to have Zhao brought before a military court. She had enough evidence against him to send Zhao to prison for a lifetime. And it was no secret that Fire Lord Oze, who would doubtlessly preside over such a trial, favored her. Sadly Zhao had all communication within his fleet closely monitored, and would no doubt personally read any letters she tried to send through official channels. When I'm in charge, I'll make sure proper procedures are put in place to prevent any other barbarians from abusing their position like this. She thought to herself as she marched through the corridors of Zhao's flagship, heading towards the helm whilst clutching a binder of papers close to her chest. She rapped sharply on the door when she arrived, and pushed her way in when Zhao's voice called for her to enter. The helm was currently a neatly organized flood of maps, astral charts and other stacks of important-looking scrolls, all organized around a large map sprawled out across the central table that showed the most up-to-date layout of the Northern Water Tribe's capital city. Various arrows had been drawn in red, all representing potential paths for troops to take in order to reach vital areas, and a large black circle had been drawn around one area that appeared to be some kind of holy shrine in the middle of a lake. It was no great secret among the officers that Zhao was planning a siege of the North Pole, but the admiral had kept his strategy infuriatingly close to his chest. Tanya stepped inside just in time to see Zhao finish locking something within a heavy safe, and tuck the key hanging from a piece of string around his neck underneath his shirt. "Admiral," she announced coolly, her face an emotionless mask as she snapped into a perfectly formal salute. "We've received another lead on the Avatar. A nearby town just reported that a young boy with airbending abilities disrupted their Fire Day festival mere hours ago." Zhao's grin was like a shark's, full of teeth and aggression, and as cold as the depths of the ocean. "Excellent. Fortune smiles upon us once again." "Fortune? Right. Nothing at all to do with the hours of complicated analysis Tanya had done since they received reports that the Avatar had been sighted in Makapa village and Moce Abbey. Assuming that the Avatar was heading to the North Pole in search of a waterbending master, Tanya had predicted the route he would take and adjusted their own course to intercept. There was as much good fortune involved here as there was playing cards with aces hidden up your sleeve. Not that Zhao would care for her mentioning it. "Gather my personal guard," Zhao declared. "There can be no mistakes this time. I'll see to the capture of the Avatar myself." "So, the Avatar was here and you let him slip away?" Zhao was not happy. Not in the slightest. Why was it that incompetency seemed to rife within the Fire Nation these days? To think that an entire town of soldiers had failed to capture one little boy who only knew how to blow air. Since when were children too much of a challenge for the Fire Nation's finest to handle? "Yes, sir, but other than that the festival went off without a hitch," the anxious leader of the town guard reported, just as a huge piece of burning wood crashed to the ground behind him. "No fights. Theft was way down. I don't care about your local crime rates." Zhao spat. "Which way did they go?" "They headed into the forest, up the river I suspect." "Not immediately north?" "Interesting." Witnesses had reported a hooded man throwing bombs had helped the Avatar escape, yet Tanya's reports had not mentioned any such figure present in his last two appearances. This smelled like an opportunity. With the cover of trees to hide them, they could ambush the Avatar before he had the chance to flee on that fat, flying cow of his. He turned to his ever-faithful right-hand woman, who stood woodenly at attention by his side. Tanya had been in a sulky mood ever since his little show of authority back at Pahui Stronghold, speaking only when spoken to, and even then only ever in a curt, formal tone. It was like watching a child try to give someone the silent treatment, except that her position as his subordinate forced her to break said silence whenever he desired it. Frankly, Zhao didn't care. He'd had to rope Tanya along with kind words at first, but she was too tightly bound to him for that to matter anymore. She was under his power, and had no means of escaping before he could launch his invasion of the North Pole. He had no doubts that the moment they returned to the homeland she'd go sniveling to the Fire Lord about what he'd done to the sages, but by then the Fire Lord wouldn't care. He hated the sages anyway, and with the title of Moon Slayer under his belt Zhao would be a hero beyond reproach. Any laws he'd broken along the way would be swept under the rug as ends justifying the means. "Ready the river boats," he commanded, watching with satisfaction as Tanya quickly, but clearly reluctantly, saluted him in acknowledgement. "We're going after the Avatar." For too long he'd trusted his subordinates to handle the task for him, but as the old adage said, if you want something done right, do it yourself. This time he'd see to the capture of the Avatar personally, and nobody, not even the Blue Spirit, would mess things up. Chapter 31. Jeong Jeong was not impressed when the Avatar returned to his cottage. "What are you doing here? I did not tell you to stop," he admonished the boy sternly. He had taken Aang up a nearby mountain with clear instructions to focus on his breathing, a vital skill for any firebender to properly learn. It had also been meant to teach the boy patience, but clearly that lesson had gone over the young nomad's head. "I've been breathing for hours," Aang protested. "You want to stop breathing? I want you to stop wasting my time. I already know how to squat and breathe and feel the sun," the Avatar replied heatedly. "I want to know how to shoot fire out of my fingertips." Oh, the folly of youth! Pretty much every fire-bending child said those same things when they started their training. It was straight into the spectacle, the destruction, with little regard for the danger of the power they wielded. Once upon a time fire-bending children were forbidden from conjuring fire until they had undergone a trial to prove their understanding of the dangers of their element. Like many of the old traditions, it had quickly been thrown away when the Great War started. Nowadays most children received nothing but military training, which went straight into how to shoot fire at their enemies from the very first lesson. A gruff sigh escaped his lips as Jeong Jeong realized that a different approach would be needed to get this lesson through to Aang. He was a good kid really, far more empathetic than most his age, but the pressure put upon him to end this terrible war was bringing out the recklessness within him. Perhaps he could use that natural empathy to teach this lesson? He was not normally one to open up about his past, but these were extraordinary circumstances. I had a pupil once who had no interest in learning discipline. He said slowly, mind already turning to form the image of Zhao. Not the hardened killer he'd become, but as the fresh-faced young cadet he'd once been when Jeong Jeong had first met him, so curious, so eager to learn, so ambitious. He was only concerned with the power of fire, how he could use it to destroy his opponents and wipe out the obstacles in his path. But fire is a horrible burden to bear. Its nature is to consume, and without control it destroys everything around it. His greatest regret in life was how he'd failed to teach Zhao the importance of control, both over fire, and over himself. Because of his failure that sweet young boy had grown into a monster ruled by pride, and had slain dozens in his vain quest for glory. Worse was that he'd picked up an apprentice of his own, the infamous devil of the South Sea, who had twice his thirst for blood if her rampage across the Earth Kingdom was any indication. Were his teachings destined to be passed down from monster to monster for generations to come, leaving a trail of bloodshed and bodies wherever they went? The thought of it made him sick to his very stomach. Learn restraint, or risk destroying yourself and everything you love, he whispered, feeling his breath hitch under the weight of his regret. The Avatar seemed to grasp the seriousness of the matter if his silence was any indication. Without a word the young nomad got up and left, leaving Jeong Jeong to grieve in the candlelight for the apprentice he'd failed. Who were those men? Tanya asked, looking back at the burning tree behind them. As they'd sailed upriver a small band of men in tribal garments wielding rudimentary weapons had tried to ambush them, but Zhao had shown no mercy in unleashing powerful waves of flames that set the trees alight and forced them to retreat. Zhao smiled mysteriously. Friends of a man I did not expect to find here. I know now why the Avatar came. He seeks tuition from Jeong Jeong. Jeong Jeong the deserter? Tanya asked, surprised by the revelation. Jeong Jeong was the only man to have deserted the Fire Nation army and escaped punishment. Well, except for another man called Che, who now she thought about it matched the profile of the explosives expert who'd been reported to have made contact with the Avatar back in the village. If the Avatar had any intention of learning fire bending, then Jeong Jeong might well be his only chance to do it. Every other firebender had been conscripted into military service. The very same. Zhao replied smugly. And my old master? Hold up, what? Zhao had been the student of the infamous Admiral Zhang? He'd certainly kept that little fact well hidden. Zhao began chuckling to himself, a sound that Tanya had never before noticed sounded so dark and ominous. This falls out better than I could devise. Jeong Jeong is an old fool bound by antiquated notions of what firebending should be. He won't have taught the Avatar so much as how to produce a spark until he's forced 100 lessons about breathing down his throat. The Avatar had wasted his time here, and now I can capture not just him but my treacherous old master too. Who could deny that destiny is on my side? Who could indeed? It really did seem sometimes like whatever Zhao wanted just fell into his lap. The sentiment proved prophetically true not a few seconds later, as the boats rounded a corner to see Jeong Jeong and the water tribe girl who accompanied the Avatar kneeling at the river bank. Zhao's grin grew so wide it seemed like it might rip his cheeks. Tanya! He commanded, as if beckoning for a dog. Attack! As much as it irritated her to be addressed like a tool, Tanya didn't really have much of a choice but to obey. She stepped casually into a stance and raised one arm, then brought it forward to unleash a powerful blast directly at the two targets. It was a powerful opening attack, but not much good against a master firebender. Jeong Jeong leapt into a defensive stance and broke the blast around him and the girl, yelling for her to find her friends and flee. He settled deeper into his stance as the boats docked against the riverbank and Zhao's elite guard jumped ashore, and then raised both hands to create a wall of blazing flames blocking them from chasing after the girl. Don't worry, men. My old teacher gave up fighting a long time ago, Zhao declared as he disembarked his ship and strode forward confidently. The flaming wall parted around him as he used fire bending to push his way through his teacher's technique. Haven't you, Master Jeong Jeong? The wall of flames began to flicker and burn out, leaving a tense silence across the riverbank as former master and apprentice stared each other down. Look at you! Zhao sneered. You were once so great. I can't believe my former master has become nothing more than a simple savage. Jeong Jeong shook his head. It is you who have embraced savagery, Zhao. He replied calmly. It's Admiral Zhao, now. That title will not help you against the Avatar. Do not try to fight him. You are no match. Zhao looked like he was struggling not to laugh. I think I can handle a child. I have never seen such raw power. Jeong Jeong replied sagely, and all at once Zhao's smirk was replaced by a furious scowl. It didn't take Tanya long to read the subtext of the conversation. Had he perhaps once told Zhao the same thing? The last thing Zhao wanted to hear was anything that denied how special he thought he was. Jeong Jeong. That voice. Tanya's head whipped around, easily locating the Avatar from where he'd just emerged from the trees. The idiot hadn't run despite Jeong Jeong's instructions. He really was a fool. We'll see. Zhao hissed, turning towards the Avatar. Men! Take the deserter! At his command, Zhao's troops surrounded and closed in on Jeong Jeong. Yet the former admiral only smirked and spun around, wrapping himself in a ball of flames that popped into a bright flash of light. When the light dissipated, the old man was nowhere to be found. It's a trick! Zhao screamed. He's run off into the woods. Tanya, find him. Yes, Admiral. Tanya replied, flames bursting to life beneath her feet. Now that Zhao had mentioned it, she could see freshly broken branches and other signs betraying the direction Jeong Jeong had run off in. She rocketed off into the forest, Zhao's soldiers running along behind her, and looked back just in time to see Zhao advancing on the Avatar. Let's find out what my old master has taught you. He snarled, settling into a fire-bending stance. Yes, let's find out indeed. Tanya thought to herself, the corner of her lips twitching into the beginnings of a smile as she turned back to the forest. Chapter 32. He was being followed. Hurrying as fast as his old bones could manage, Jeong Jeong pushed his way through the undergrowth. He could feel a phantom heat on the back of his neck, and hear the crackle of burning trees not too far behind him. Nobody could accuse ex-Admiral Jeong of being lazy. He worked hard every day to keep his body in peak physical condition. Yet the sad truth was that age had long since begun to rob him of the ferocious stamina that had made him a great warrior in his youth. Already he was tiring, while his pursuer was not. I cannot outrun them, he thought sadly. Although the Fire Nation had fallen from grace, he knew better than most that many of the soldiers did not truly desire war, and he had not wished to harm anyone if it could be avoided. Yet if his pursuer was determined to chase him down, it appeared he was left with little choice. Taking a left turn, Jeong Jeong ducked his way through a bramble bush and emerged into a clearing. Casually he walked to the center of the glade, listening to the calming sounds of nature around him. He could hear the twittering of birds, the chirping of insects, the rustling of the leaves as a calm breeze blew through them, all the sounds of the world in balance. A relaxed sigh escaped his lips as he breathed deeply, savoring the presence of nature and all the life within it around him. How beautiful the world was when in harmony. And now misguided his countrymen were, that they were unable to see it. Breathe in. Breathe out. Whoosh. Behind him the bramble bush erupted into fire, and all at once the birds and insects flew away in panic, leaving the glade silent but for the hollow crackling of the flames. Jeong Jeong could not help the disappointed frown that crossed his face. Fire really did nothing but destroy the harmony of the world. As the flames consumed it, the bramble bush collapsed under its own weight, and his pursuer stepped out over it into the glade. Jeong Jeong noted her sunlight gold hair with curiosity, then the trail of burning foliage left in her wake with disapproval. This was Zhao's apprentice then? The fearsome devil child? She did not appear to be strong, but the fact that she had apparently flown through the forest after him using the jet propulsion spoke of immense skill. It could not have been easy to hone reactions quick enough to fly through trees. I was hoping we'd meet one day, student of my student. He began conversationally. Though I admit, I had hoped for better circumstances. Tanya, isn't it? It is. The girl replied in a sharp tone. But I'm not Zhao's student. Oh? But you are the Sun Fairy, are you not? The girl's face warped into a nasty scowl. I prefer the devil of the South Sea. How sad it was that a girl so young believed it better to be a devil than a fairy. Then perhaps we should just stick to names. Please, call me Jeong. I think I'd rather call you traitor. Tanya hissed. Jeong Jeong cocked his head to the side. Are you sure you aren't Zhao's student? Those sound awfully like his words coming out of your mouth. Tanya's scowl deepened into a rictus of fury, and with a yell she hurled a quick fireball at him. Seems he'd struck a rather raw nerve there. With one hand Jeong Jeong slapped the fireball away, making sure to angle it up so that it wouldn't hit the forest, and tut. You lack control, just like he does. I have control. Tanya spat. No, you have precision. Jeong Jeong shot back. You hone your fire into a sharp blade, but still you swing it only for the purpose of destruction. That is not control. Control lies as restraint, in knowing when to sheath your blade. Tanya scoffed loudly. What is this? A lecture from a tree-hugging hippie? What do you know about control? Fire Lord Oze controls the Fire Nation, soon the entire world, yet I don't see him lounging around these woods smoking pondweed. In fact, ever since you deserted I'd say you don't have control of anything. Jeong Jeong shook his head. I speak of self-control, not using manipulation to control others. Well then shut up, because nobody wants to hear you. Kids these days. When did they get so rude? Having said that, she hadn't attacked him yet, despite her world to the contrary. Perhaps it still wasn't too late to resolve this peacefully. Tell me this then, do you feel in control? That seemed to make the young girl pause, staring at him for a moment as if she suspected she'd misheard him. What? It's a simple question. Do you feel like you are in control? The golden-haired girl scowled. Of what? Of your life. Of your destiny. Of yourself. Tanya shifted uncomfortably. It seemed he'd struck another nerve. Of course I do. She snapped unconvincingly. When was the last time that you made a decision for yourself? Jeong pressed. Did you want to join the military, or was it forced upon you? Do you fight because you want to, or because you are ordered to? Are you in control of your life, or is Zhao? Shut up! Tanya yelled, settling into a proper fighting stance. I'll be free of Zhao soon enough. Jeong Jeong shook his head. No child, you will not. You may free yourself of this Zhao, but you will always find someone else standing above you, trying to make you obey them, serve them, even worship them. As long as you lack control there will always be another Zhao. It was impossible not to notice the way the girl visibly flinched at the word worship, and Jeong Jeong idly wondered what his old apprentice must have done to her to warrant such a reaction. I understand what you feel, Tanya. You have been thrown into a war not of your own making, and others have turned your trust, fear and anger against you to make you into their puppet. But there is more to life than just fighting to survive. There is a greater purpose than giving your life to a cause that is not your own. He took a step towards her, noting that she did not back away from him. Let me show you. I can teach you how to control your inner fire, and in doing so control yourself. Nobody else will ever be able to manipulate you again. You will be free. Tanya didn't reply, her expression wrestling between confusion and doubt. Jeong took another step forward, then another, until he was right in front of her. He placed one wizened hand on her shoulder. And gasped in surprise as a flaming fist struck him square in the stomach. Jeong Jeong darted backwards, just in time to avoid the follow-up kick that sent a blast of fire towards his head. Yet even that much movement caused a bolt of pure agony through his body. The burn was deep and raw, probably meant to kill. I can't believe you fell for that. You must think I'm some naive child, don't you? A grin had spread across Tanya's lips, wide and sharp, like a wolf that had smelled blood. It was such an unnaturally malicious expression to see on a young girl's face that Jeong Jeong took another step back in alarm. You think you can wave pretty words like freedom around and expect me to give up a lifetime of accomplishments? Ha! Get real! Tanya continued, golden eyes burning like molten amber. Was it just his imagination, or was she starting to laugh? Sure, there's always going to be someone above me telling me what to do, and some of those people are going to be tyrannical assholes like Zhao. But so what? Every good organization needs rules. She punctuated her point by bringing her hands together and unleashing a huge blast of flames that roared towards him like a giant serpent. Jeong sliced downwards, separating the fire blast in two around him, and winced at the pain it caused his fresh injury. To his horror, the flames continued onwards even after being split, spilling out into the surrounding trees and setting a couple of the trees alight. I've met people like you before, you know. People who whine and complain about the work their boss makes them do. People who moan about how unfairly the rules are, or how badly they believe they're treated. Tanya was striding forwards now, fireballs growing in both hands, and oh yes, she was definitely laughing. What they fail to comprehend is that if they truly want to make change, griping about it or quitting ain't gonna change shit. She threw one fireball, which Jeong deflected with one hand with considerably more effort than he was comfortable with. If you want to make a difference, you gotta earn the right to. You gotta claw and kick and fight your way up the greasy ladder of power until you're the one with the authority to do something about it. She threw her second fireball, and this time as Jeong Jeong made to deflect it, he pulled on his wound badly, breaking his form as pain lanced through his side. The fireball struck him and knocked the old man to the ground. And believe me, I'm gonna do something about it, Tanya declared, the light of the forest fire growing around them highlighting the madness in her features. You think I'm going to just roll over and submit, to you, Zhao or anyone else? Fuck that. I'm heading straight to the top of the military, and I'll remove anyone who gets in my way. I'll help bring an end to this war in whatever way I deem appropriate. I'll be the one making the rules. She laughed, a high-pitched, childish sound drunk upon insanity, and at that moment Jeong Jeong finally realized his mistake. This was no misguided child he was dealing with, no impressionable youth being led astray down the wrong path. This girl truly was a devil in human skin. You are ruled by your own pride. He spat, pushing himself to his feet and trying to ignore the way his knees wobbled with exertion. You are spinning out of control. It will be your undoing. Well, see about that. Tanya shot back. Chapter 33. This girl truly was a devil in human skin. You are ruled by your own pride. He spat, pushing himself to his feet and trying to ignore the way his knees wobbled with exertion. You are spinning out of control. It will be your undoing. Well, see about that. Tanya shot back. She opened her hand and pushed it towards him in a palm thrust motion, and a net of fire burst from it, widening as it flew towards him. Jeong Jeong brought his hand together in a prayer-like gesture, waiting until the net was right on top of him, and then slashed forwards, carving a hole in the net that allowed him to pass through unharmed. Yet again the flames carried onwards into the forest behind him, bolstering what was now a rapidly growing forest fire. Tanya advanced, punching forward to unleash a steady stream of flames at him. Jeong ducked to the side and returned fire with a stream of his own, though his had a special trick to it. With his other hand he pointed two fingers to the right, and the stream began to twist in a clockwise direction like a horizontal hurricane. Tanya skipped to the right to dodge the initial stream, grinning conceitedly, and then yelped in alarm as the stream began to twist and whip around towards her by itself, forcing her to jump farther to narrowly avoid it. The rushed movement led to a sloppy landing, and Jeong Jeong pressed his advantage when he noticed the girl's awkward footing. 3 rapid punches created a trio of quick fireballs that soared towards her like diving birds. Unable to properly dodge, Tanya was forced to conjure a shield of fire and tank the hits. The first she took well, only stumbling back a little as it collided with her shield, but the next 2 hit in unison, providing enough force to knock her off her feet. Though not, it seemed, to the ground. Rather than resist the fall, Tanya fell back into it like a diver. Flames erupted from her hands and feet, propelling her rapidly backwards just an inch or 2 from the ground and then up, until she was hovering in the sky just above the treeline. Jeong Jeong had considered himself a master of the propulsion technique too, but even he had to reluctantly admit that he paled in comparison. The golden child of the Fire Nation pushed through the air with an ease none could ever hope to match, as if flying had been second nature to her from the moment she was born. No wonder they called her the fairy. There were other fire-bending masters who could be considered stronger than her, but her overwhelming skill with this particular technique changed the very dimensions of combat to her advantage. He would be a fool to try and fight her in the air. Instead, Jeong Jeong settled into a deeper defensive stance. Like the turtle fighting the crane, he would take cover in his shell and let his foe tire itself. Opportunity would come when Tanya ran out of energy she needed to power her flight. Yet to his surprise, Tanya did not attack. Instead, she grinned that wicked grin of hers, and shot fireballs into the surrounding forest. Was she mocking him by further destroying the nature he cared for? How dishonorable! You know, I'm pleasantly surprised. I'd expected you to have run away by now. Tanya taunted. I am no coward. Jeong Jeong replied. No? You certainly could have fooled me. Running away from the war sure is an interesting way of proving your courage. Jeong Jeong frowned. Cowardice would have been to follow orders, pretending that it being for the sake of my nation absolved me of any guilt. True courage is found in walking your own path despite others telling you how you should live your life. I disagree. True courage would have been trying to convince others to share your path with you, even if they hated you for it. Tanya shot back. You could have done more to end this war as an admiral than you can hiding in a forest. Jeong opened his mouth to reply, when a sudden tightness gripped his chest. Each breath became heavy and musty, as if he couldn't get quite enough air no matter how hard he panted. One hand shot to the wound on his chest, yet despite the feverish heat about it that did not seem to be the cause of his plight. What's the matter, old man? Out of breath already? Tanya's smug voice rained down from above, and the cruel delight on her expression removed any doubt as to whether she was responsible. How? Jeong croaked. Tanya nodded towards the forest fire spreading around them, encasing the glade in a ring of flames. Fire needs oxygen to burn. Looks like the supply down there is running out fast. Devious child. Jeong Jeong repositioned from his defensive stance, preparing to jet into the air himself, but was interrupted as a wave of fire washed out across the glade from the burning tree behind him. Quickly he spun and split a safe path through the flames, only for yet another wave to crash towards him from his right. You know, firebending really is much easier when there are existing sources nearby. Tanya remarked, swishing her arms to send a third fire wave his way. No wonder those earthbenders have proven so troublesome to get rid of. Jeong carved his way through the waves again, but the tightness in his chest was growing alarmingly sharp. He had to escape the trap she'd caught him in. But how? The answer came to him in a flash. She was not the only one who could make use of the forest fire. Drawing his arms in, Jeong Jeong's mind returned to memories of the days he had spent with his dear friend Master Paku. The Grand Masters of the White Lotus had all spent time in each other's homelands, teaching one another the history, philosophy, and culture of their respective nations. Jeong Jeong had always wished to be a waterbender himself, and had studied some of Paku's techniques with great interest. One such study had borne unexpected fruit. Jeong Jeong's arms moved in twisting, serpentine motions, like ancient dragons coiling through the sky. The forest fires around him began to bend and writhe, reshaping themselves according to his will. Like the tendrils of a great leviathan, 10 fiery tentacles, each as thick as tree trunks, snaked out of the forest and surrounded Tanya. The devil child looked around with wide eyes, taken aback by the unexpected technique. Okay, never seen that one before. He heard her murmur to herself. Jeong snapped his arms towards Tanya, and the tendrils whipped at her from every direction. It was like watching a hydra try to devour a housefly. Tanya bobbed and weaved with frightening agility, blasting herself in ever-shifting directions in a way that would have shaken Jeong's old bones apart. Yet while one tendril struck, the other 9 circled around the area, ready to take their chance the moment she dodged in their direction. That the girl managed to dodge them all for so long spoke of reflexes honed sharply enough to split hairs on. Yet unlike most modern fire-bending techniques, Jeong's fire tendrils were not made to burn brightly but quickly. Again and again they came back, relentlessly pushing Tanya to the limits of her agility. Eventually one tendril finally got lucky, scoring a direct hit on Tanya's shin that had her scream in agony. Down she went like a falling kite, crashing roughly back into the glade. Most would have been defeated by such a great fall, and Jeong Jeong was silently impressed when the girl got back up again, covered in grass stains and bruises, and notably limping on her injured leg, but with unmistakable determination alight in her eyes. She would have made a fine student if only she would abandon the path she was on. A shame that the stakes were too high for him to risk trying to convince her again. Jeong fought for breath, the edges of his vision starting to blur as the first signs of oxygen deprivation began to set in, and on the other side of the glade he noticed Tanya doing the same. Neither of them had much time left. This next exchange would settle it. Extending both arms out, Jeong Jeong focused upon the chi energy within himself. He brought one arm sweeping low, funneling his negative yin chi down it, then repeated the motion with the other arm, funneling his positive yang chi into that. Then, with the utmost focus, he brought his arms back together, allowing the two energies to recollide and form crackling lightning with their union. One well-aimed bolt of lightning would bring an end to this fight quickly and efficiently. He had expected Tanya to try taking to the air again, or at least begin making some attempt to dodge even with a wounded leg, yet to his shock she didn't. Instead she stood her ground. "I give you one last chance, girl. Surrender." Jeong Jeong called out. "I do not wish to kill you." Tanya did not answer. She only settled into a stance of her own, her face set in stone. The message was clear, there would be no surrender. So be it. Jeong Jeong extended 2 fingers forward, and from them roared a bolt of pure lightning that ripped through the air as it hurtled towards Tanya. Yet even as he had moved, so had Tanya. Lightning was quick, precise, and powerful. It was nearly impossible to avoid unless you were already out of the line of fire before it was launched. With that in mind, it was impressive enough that Tanya almost avoided it. Bursts of flame so intense they seemed to glow white for a second erupted from her feet as she threw herself to the side, scorching the grass beneath her to a blackened pool of ash in the blink of an eye as she rocketed to the side. Yet still she was not quite quick enough. The lightning bolt that should have pierced straight through the middle of her chest instead speared through her left forearm, blasting a burning hole straight through it with contemptuous ease. Yet even as her face contorted in pain, Tanya's eyes still flashed victoriously. From her right hand a bolt of fire about the size of a baseball curved through the air, following back along the lightning's path. The sudden flash of light from his own attack had filled Jeong Jeong's old eyes with spots, and in the span of the 2 blinks it took to clear them the fire bolt was too close to avoid. It smashed into his chest, right on top of the nasty burn Tanya had inflicted at the beginning of the fight, and melted through the weakened flesh like candle wax, carving a path through Jeong's organs and out of the other side. Tanya collapsed on the ground, hissing profanities with agony as she clutched at her still smoking arm. But to Jeong Jeong her words sounded oddly muted, like he was hearing them through a thick veil of wool. In fact, all the sounds of the world around him, from the rustling leaves to the crackling fire, sounded distant and far away. The only noise he could hear clearly was the pumping of his blood in his ears, which grew weaker and weaker with each heartbeat. This is the end. The thought crossed his mind with a sense of calm certainty. An instinctive feeling deep within his soul which told him that his time had finally come. He'd always expected to feel regret gnawing away at him when death finally came to claim him, and was pleasantly surprised with himself to find that wasn't true. There were still things he would have liked to have said and done, but he felt no compulsion to feverishly cling to them. Like the airbenders of old, he felt his spirit become untethered from his mortal concerns one by one, bringing lightness and freedom to his weary spirit. A gentle darkness, like the lull of a deep sleep, began to roll in from the edges of his eyes. Jeong fell to his knees, then to the ground, letting the soft caress of the grass embrace him. In his final moments, Jeong Jeong thought of Aang. The boy was young and sometimes impatient, yet he'd had the wisdom to recognize his mistakes and the courage to admit them. The boy would be quick to grow into the man that the world needed him to become by summer's end. Yes, Jeong could rest easy knowing that the world would be safe in the Avatar's hands. And so, with one last breath, the old Grandmaster closed his eyes, and let the darkness claim him. Chapter 34. Fire roared in uncontrolled joy across the decks of his boats, mocking him for his failure. Zhao seethed with white-hot fury. He'd been tricked. Lured into destroying his own boats by a 10-year-old child. Humiliation fueled his rage, urging him to lash out, but with proof of what such recklessness led to burning away in front of him he dared not. With no outlet for his surplus aggression, he found himself paralyzed by it, standing dumbly in the water as his body trembled with wild wrath. The Avatar had beaten him. And hadn't even thrown a single punch to do it. No luck capturing the Avatar? Welcome to the club. Zhao's spine stiffened. Who dared to speak to him that way? Slowly his head turned back to the riverbank, bloodshot eyes fixating on the blonde-haired girl who stood there, cradling one arm. Tanya. I hope, for your sake, he ground out between gnashed teeth, trying to force himself to stay calm. Jeong Jeong is dead. Because I swear to Agni, if you failed me again, the very ground you stand on will be your grave. That old windbag. Tanya snorted dismissively. Tougher than I'd expected, but still no match for me. He's dead. Dead. Master Jeong Jeong was dead. Since the moment he'd heard the news that his mentor had turned traitor, Zhao had longed to be the one to bring him to justice. He'd dreamed of how satisfying it must be to strike down the man who'd berated him with constant, wasteful lessons on restraint. Had restraint saved Jeong's life in the end? No, it hadn't. Restraint was for the weak, like Prince Zuko or his clown of an uncle. The strong did not pull their punches. And yet, despite his expectations, Zhao did not feel happy to learn of his master's death as he'd expected to. Instead it left him feeling oddly twisted up inside. I see. He muttered, turning away to face the river. Very good then. At least one threat to the Fire Nation has been taken care of. Oh please. Tanya scoffed. Do you really think crowing on about killing a senile old man would be enough to distract the Fire Lord from Turyalir to capture the Avatar? Zhao's head snapped around like a whip, eyes so hot with rage it almost seemed like fire might shoot from them. All at once his impotent anger found a convenient target. How dare you? He hissed, striding forwards to Tanya. As he got close enough he raised one arm and struck, delivering a heavy backhanded slap right across her cheek. It only infuriated him all the more when Tanya didn't react to it at all. You dare to imply that I am the failure here? Me? He would not be seen as a failure. He refused. He would never allow for his reputation to be sullied. In the feverish madness of his anger, inspiration struck. Why did you not capture the Avatar? You are the one who the task fell to. Because you ordered me to chase your hobbling old master. Tanya sneered. No doubt petty sentiment blinded you to what was truly important. I'll make sure the Fire Lord knows exactly what really happened here. No. No. The Fire Lord must never discover the truth of what happened. If he lost the Fire Lord's approval now all his plans would fall apart. The fleet he'd been gathering to storm the North Pole would be disbanded in the blink of an eye. There was only one way to stop the truth from getting out. Zhao straightened, a steely coolness entering his eyes. I warned you before that failing to capture the Avatar again would mean your execution. He growled. Yet far from being intimidated, Tanya scoffed. You won't kill me. She stated, with all the casual certainty of one remarking on the weather. Oh. Zhao leaned in closer so that his eyes bored directly into hers. And why, pray tell, is that? Tanya's eyes flickered to something over his shoulder, and her signature creepy smile spread across her lips. Because without me, who is going to protect you from him? Zhao whirled around, body instinctively settling into a defensive stance to protect himself from an ambush. Someone had snuck up behind him. Who had she partnered with? Master Jeong? The Avatar? The Fire Lord? Yet there was nothing behind him but empty space. Bam! A hollow thud struck Zhao in the back, stealing his breath away in an instant, and bright orange light filled his vision. It was over as quickly as it had begun, leaving spots swimming across his eyes. What was that? What just happened? Numbly he looked down towards his chest, which felt strangely heavy. Oh! A large hole the size of a fist, outlined with blackened and charred flesh, loomed back at him from out of his own torso. He craned his head back to look at Tanya, who stood behind him with a smoking hand pressed against his back. You! He managed to gasp out weakly, before his knees buckled. Strangely enough Tanya gripped his shoulders to stop him from falling and gravity claimed him, and lowered him gently backwards to lay in the shallow water of the river bank. SSSHHH now, it's okay, don't fight it. She whispered soothingly as she set him down, like a nurse offering a facade of comfort to a patient as they unplugged their life support. Zhao's hands fumbled weakly towards her throat in a last attempt to strangle his treacherous subordinate, but she casually slapped them away. Tanya knelt down in the river beside him, tiny waves lapping at her knees as she cradled Zhao's head to keep it just above water level. You know, I really do regret that it had to end this way. She said with uncharacteristic gentleness. Idly she swept a lock of hair off of his face. Things got rough between us at the end, but for most of the time I've known you, you've been the perfect superior. Nobody else would have promoted a girl as young and seemingly inexperienced as me all the way up through the ranks so quickly. They would have assumed I was untested, or too immature. But not you. A wicked gleam flashed across her eyes. No, to you it didn't matter who I was or where I came from, so long as I could destroy your enemies. A perfect meritocrat. By staying in your shadow and fueling your rise, I could rise myself without scrutiny. But you know. Tanya trailed off, her lips turning down into a small, sad frown. Your master Jeong Jeong helped me realize that we'd reached the end of that arrangement. Like any manager who rises upon the work of a skilled subordinate, you'd reached the top and wanted to keep me in your shadow forever in order to stay there. You'd become the final hurdle I needed to clear in order to fulfill my own ambitions. So in the end, what other choice do I have but to kill you? When given the choice between being a murderer or a slave, I'd pick murderer any time. I think you would too. A gurgle of blood welled up in Zhao's throat, causing him to cough it up violently over his chin. Tanya tugged and wiped it away. But don't worry Zhao. I know how much glory meant to you, and out of respect for everything you've done for me I'll make sure you still get it. The whole Fire Nation will know how, upon learning that your own treacherous master was teaching the Avatar fire bending, you gallantly rushed here to confront them. How ferociously you fought the Avatar, who was drunk on the power of learning the superior element. How you would have won had the Avatar not grovelled before you in fake surrender, then struck you from behind like a coward the moment you turned your back. Tanya leaned in closer, her golden yellow eyes locked on Zhao's like a bird of prey swooping towards its next meal. One of her hands reached down into his shirt and pulled out the key he wore around his neck. But do you know what will be best of all? Once I lead the successful conquest of the North Pole, I capture the Avatar, and I am hailed as the greatest hero of the Fire Nation, I'll have a statue of you built. I'll tell everyone who'll listen the story of the wise mentor who spotted me as a diamond in the rough, how you gave me the guidance and opportunities to make something of myself in the military, and how right now, with your dying breath, you told me the secret to conquering the North. Tanya's smile would have seemed so sweet and innocent, had the blazing gold of her eyes not shone with cruel, violent glee. You will attain the eternal glory you craved as an extension of my legend Zhao. Ironic, considering how you tried to make me an extension of yours. Zhao croaked out a final, feeble attempt at an insult, but could barely muster the strength to lift his head. His body felt heavy and sluggish, like it was filled with lead, and darkness was rapidly creeping into the edges of his vision. As his eyelids grew heavy, Tanya lowered him down into the water, smiling ghoulishly above his body like a demon waiting to claim his soul. Sleep now, Zhao. I'll take care of the rest. With a heart full of fear and regret, Zhao's eyes fell closed for the last time, and the darkness swarmed in to swallow him up just as it had his master. Chapter 35. The crew of Ajalan's Revenge stood at attention in deathly silence, ignoring the drizzle of rain dripping down their armor from the grey clouds above. Night had nearly come, but the large braziers that had been set up across the deck blazed heartily enough to keep them warm. Nobody dared utter a word, but a sense of uncertainty and trepidation hung over them like a thick shroud. Hours ago Zhao's raiding party had returned from their hunt for the Avatar on foot, and it hadn't taken long to notice that the tall, imposing man who should have been leading them had been replaced by the little girl with golden hair who inspired such awe and terror in equal measure. It hadn't taken 10 minutes before urgent whispers had passed the news around the entire ship. Admiral Zhao was dead. With him gone, command of the crew fell to Commander Tanya, but that did little to ease the crew's minds. Everyone knew that the fleet of ships Zhao had been amassing was for some kind of huge invasion, but Zhao had been less than forthcoming about what exactly the plan was. With him gone, the question of what would happen now hung on everyone's minds. If the fleet broke apart, it would be a massive waste of the time and resources that had been put into assembling them. But what other choice was there? Who else could lead the invasion but Zhao? No doubt Commander Tanya had called them here to answer those very questions. As their golden-haired leader walked up to a podium before them, rain dripping down her stoic face like teardrops and soaking the bandages sling covering one arm into a damp grey mess, none of the crew doubted that behind her indifferent expression Tanya must be grieving terribly. It was just like her to keep a strong face for their sake, but everyone knew how loyal she had been to Admiral Zhao. She had been his perfect soldier, following his orders dutifully and efficiently, and always by his side no matter how high up the ranks he climbed. Once news that she was an orphan had spread around the rumor mill, some had even theorized that she was secretly Zhao's daughter, and had joined the navy in order to get to know him. Soldiers of the Fire Nation! Tanya yelled, her voice carrying across the deck with practiced ease. Her tone, like her stance, gave away nothing about how she was feeling besides cold stoicism. No doubt you have all heard the rumors, and I have come to confirm them. Earlier today Admiral Zhao did indeed lose his life in battle with the Avatar. Using cowardly fire-bending techniques learned at the foot of the traitor Jeong Jeong, the Avatar struck Admiral Zhao while his back was turned. Outraged mutterings began to break out across the crowd, but Tanya silenced them immediately with a raised fist. His sacrifice will not be forgotten, nor will the Avatar's dishonorable acts, but now is not the time for grieving. The Admiral assembled this fleet for the greatest military campaign our nation has embarked upon since the siege of Ba Sing Se, and in his dying breath he told me the secret to his invasion plan. A secret I will not allow to go to waste. Tanya straightened, and for a moment it seemed like she genuinely grew taller. The aura of authority that surrounded her demanded their absolute attention. Under military procedures following the death of a high-ranking commanding officer, I hereby temporarily claim the rank of acting admiral until further orders are received from the homeland. And my first order, to be relayed across the entire fleet, is to continue amassing as per the late Admiral Zhao's instructions. She looked out across the crowd, silently daring anyone to refute her claim, and when nobody did so nodded approvingly. Return to your posts and prepare yourself for further orders. Very soon you will all have a part to play in the most heroic battle this war has ever seen. Admiral Zhao's death will not mean the end of the legacy he began. We will finish what he started." She saluted, and was rewarded by 1,000 soldiers saluting her back in thunderous unison. "For the glory of the Fire Nation!" she yelled. "For the glory of the Fire Nation!" Thousands of voices echoed back. With that, Tanya turned and walked away, leaving the soldiers to go about their business as she stormed directly to the helm. The moment the door was closed behind her, the controlled expression on her face broke apart, sliding easily back into the wolfish grin she'd been struggling to keep off her face for hours. With a skip in her step, Tanya strode over to the heavy safe in the corner of the room, took the key she'd stolen from Zhao out of her pocket, and inserted it into the lock. Truth be told, she had absolutely no idea what Zhao was planning, but as long as everyone else thought she did, they'd never dare question her right to take command. It was Zhao's dubious promise of a great victory that was holding this fleet together, and as long as she appeared to be the only one left who could provide it, her position of acting admiral was secure. Not that she'd be merely an acting admiral for long after successfully conquering the North Pole. Bring a prize like that to the Fire Lord, and being formally granted the rank of admiral would be the least of her rewards. All she had to do now was actually conquer the North. Easier said than done, but if Zhao thought it possible, he must have at least been sitting on some tasty information he intended to exploit. Information he likely kept within this very safe. The safe door swung open, revealing a single scroll inside, dusty brown and old, like a relic from a museum. Carefully Tanya opened the scroll, staring curiously at the picture of two fish swimming in a circle around each other. Two words were displayed below the picture in big, bold letters: Moon and Ocean. As her eyes scanned the content of the scroll, the devilish grin on Tanya's face grew just a little sharper. The military base was a bustling hive of activity. It was like a living creature, the soldiers who carried supplies along dirt roads, its blood vessels, the messenger hawks flying back and forth, its nerves, and the tents stocked full of food, beds, and all the other services essential to life, its organs. And at the center of the camp stood the brain that controlled everything, the command tent. Inside, the various commanders and important captains of the fleet sat around a rectangular table. All eyes were turned towards a large map of the world placed at the far end, and the small girl with golden hair who stood beside it. Scouts have confirmed that the Avatar's bison was seen flying out towards the North Pole no less than 2 days ago. No doubt he intends to find a waterbending teacher among the northern water tribes. Tanya's voice was even and formal, yet with a sharp bite to it that demanded attention. It was a tone she had developed long ago specifically for debriefing subordinates who might ignore her instructions because of her age, and had had many opportunities to perfect. As many of you suspected, the late Admiral Zhao's plan was indeed a full-scale invasion of the North Pole. By subduing the last of the resistance from the water tribes now, it would mean that the plan to defeat the Earth Kingdom when Sozin's comet arrives will signal a decisive end to this war. The Avatar's presence presents both an opportunity and a threat. With 3 elements under his belt and whatever spiritual tricks he has up his sleeves, he will no doubt prove to be a significant asset to the northern tribes' forces. If we can capture him, however, we remove one more obstacle that may seek to protect the Earth Kingdom on the day of the comet's arrival. Then what are we waiting for? Let's go get him! One of the assembled men shouted. Patience, Captain Li. He who fails to plan, plans for failure. Tanya replied sternly. This is not the first time a siege of the North Pole has been attempted, and to succeed where our predecessors have failed we must understand why they failed. Our strategy must be foolproof. Yes, the fabled great plan Zhao left to you. The one our esteemed acting admiral will not deign to share with her commanders. Captain Li interrupted sarcastically. Perhaps if we knew what the whole strategy was, we might be able to make it foolproof? Most of the men here have served in the military longer than you have been alive. Who knows, we may just have some worthwhile advice to offer. The only thing we know right now is that you've been sending our ships out to old battlefields for Agni knows what reason. Tanya's cold glare fixed on the captain, causing a couple of the fully grown men sitting next to him to shuffle in their seats uncomfortably. It was a credit to his resolve, or his stubbornness, that Captain Li himself did not wilt away under it. The plan, Captain, is a top secret of national importance. When the Fire Lord approved my appointment as acting admiral, he decreed that information to be on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know. Tanya hissed back, her icy glare daring him to challenge the Fire Lord's authority. When Captain Li did not speak up again, she continued. I am aware that many of you are displeased at having to take orders from a girl younger than some of your granddaughters, but to imply that I am incapable of leading this invasion is to imply that the Fire Lord was wrong to appoint me. Tell me, would anybody else like to question the Fire Lord's will? Chapter 36. I am aware that many of you are displeased at having to take orders from a girl younger than some of your granddaughters, but to imply that I am incapable of leading this invasion is to imply that the Fire Lord was wrong to appoint me. Tell me, would anybody else like to question the Fire Lord's will? Her eyes scanned the room as a tense silence descended, noting which of the assembled men were capable of holding her gaze and which could not. It was slightly worrying how many of the commanders were so easily cowed. Nobody? Good. Then nobody will have any problems with following the instructions I give you to the letter. The enemy cannot be allowed to learn the core of our strategy, so each of you will be told enough to play your role as required and nothing more. Leave worrying about how it all fits into the big picture to me. If I may, Admiral. One of the commanders, a wizened old man with a long, graying beard, spoke up. Might we return to your earlier point? What caused the previous invasions of the North to fail? Tanya's expression shifted back to one of neutral formality. An excellent question. Every nation's military favors strategies that suit the strengths of their enlisted benders. We prefer fast, aggressive strategies to complement our firebenders, just as the Earth Kingdom favors fortified positions and defensive maneuvers to complement their earthbenders. Tanya pulled down a rolled-up parchment that had been pinned to the top of the world map, revealing it to be their most current map of the layout of the Northern Water Tribe's capital city. To date, every invasion of the North Pole has followed the same routine. Our ships arrived at the break of dawn, using the power of the sun to push forwards as quickly and aggressively as possible during the day. The Water Tribe soldiers used their walls and other defensive positions to delay us, but unlike the Earth Kingdom would easily give up these positions and fall back before they could be overwhelmed. Rather than attempt to repel us, they focused on delaying our advances for as long as possible while preserving their strength. Tanya's expression turned grave. Then the sun would set, and just as our firebenders' powers fell, so too would the rising moon empower their waterbenders. Suddenly their soldiers turned around and began fighting back, using the strength they'd conserved during the day to push our forces back out of whatever territory they'd lost during the night. Like the tide flowing in and out. Then our only course of action is to take the entire city before the sun sets. The wizened commander asked, stroking his beard. A sound analysis, but ultimately impractical. Tanya replied. Their walls are too high, and their traps too numerous, for a fleet even twice our size to power through so quickly. Then what if we fortify the territory we capture during the day? Another commander offered. If we attack on the night of a new moon, their waterbender strength won't be that much stronger than it is during the day. We could hold out through the night, and resume our push forwards at daybreak. Again, sound in theory, but not in practice. Tanya admonished. That tactic was attempted 85 years ago by Admiral Han. He failed to consider that the entire Northern Water Tribe is built upon carved ice. There are no fortifications we can make that the waterbenders cannot simply sink into the ground. I do not see how it is possible then. The wizened commander said with concern. What plan could Zhao have possibly concocted that can overcome all that? As I have said, the plan is top secret. Tanya replied. I will however reveal that it is not to attack during a new moon, as all other invasions have. Quite the opposite in fact. For it to work, the waterbenders must be confident in their strength. Therefore we will be setting sail in a few days' time. When we arrive the first day will be used for a bombardment, and for the first night we will remain out at sea. The second day we will begin the invasion in earnest, and that night. Tanya grinned, a predatory gleam shining in her golden eyes. Will be the night of a full moon. The resulting uproar blended together into a deafening mass of incoherent noise, drowning out any individual comments. Even with her sternest glare it still took Tanya a good couple of minutes to restore order. Peace, gentlemen, peace. This rambling does none of us credit. You may speak your thoughts, but do so one at a time. This is madness. Captain Li shouted urgently. Everyone knows never to fight a waterbender beneath a full moon, never mind a city of them. We'll be massacred. What trick could possibly counteract the moon? Tanya grinned then, a wicked, malicious smile that sent a chill down the spines of every man present. Fear not, Captain Li. The moon will not be an issue. Though she said it so casually, the confidence behind her words caught the assembled officers off guard. It was as if she was saying something she already knew to be a foregone conclusion. The only thing I need to do, she continued, a hint of sharp teeth peeking out from between her lips, is pay a visit to a childhood friend. Katara couldn't help the defeated sigh that slipped out of her lips. Yagoda was an excellent teacher. It was a little embarrassing sitting in with a class of girls half her age, but the veteran healer had been patient and understanding. In the span of a few hours she had already learned an incredible amount about how to use her healing gifts to their full potential. But I don't want to just learn how to heal, she thought. I want to learn how to fight alongside Aang. You seem distracted, Katara. Care to share your thoughts? Katara looked up from the dummy she was practicing on to find Yagoda kneeling next to her, her expression serene and understanding. It's nothing. She lied. If it was nothing, it would not bother you so. Yagoda replied, no hint of judgment in her tone. A healer is trained not just to remedy issues of the body, but the mind as well. Speak, Katara. It will do you no good to bottle your thoughts up, and nothing you say will leave this room. It's just. Katara paused, struggling to put her thoughts into words. I don't understand why you follow this silly tradition of not letting women fight. It's insulting. The other nations have proven that women can fight just as well as men can. You've met warrior women? Yagoda asked, genuinely curious. Yes. The Kyoji warriors are some of the most respected warriors in the Earth Kingdom, without even being benders. Katara replied passionately. The women of my home village fought back the southern raiders for years. And the Fire Nation? The Fire Nation had the girl with the golden hair. The one she'd seen twice now in the company of Zhao. Tanya, Aang had said her name was. Katara had yet to see her fight, but Aang had told her about their encounters back at Roku's shrine and the stronghold. He'd said she was highly skilled, describing his experiences trying to evade her as like trying to outrun a wolf, yet had also claimed she had come across as reasonable, if misguided, during their one chance to talk. It was strange to think that a girl younger than her had apparently climbed so high up the ranks of the military, but no doubt spoke of her competency as a fighter. She described her to Yagoda, and was surprised when the elderly healer frowned in a way that spoke of recognition. The devil of the South Sea, she said disapprovingly. Who? Katara asked, taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. Not someone you should aspire to imitate. Yagoda warned, her expression uncharacteristically grave. Even here in the north, where we keep ourselves isolated from the rest of the world, word of her deeds has reached us. She's famous? Katara asked, surprised to find that Zhao's little shadow was a celebrity. Notorious would be a better word. Yagoda replied. She is single-handedly credited with the deaths of hundreds of Earth Kingdom soldiers, and has ordered the deaths of thousands more. Rumors say she is completely without compassion or mercy. A killer to the core. What? No, you must be mistaken. The Tanya we've met is just a little girl. Katara stuttered, shocked by revelation. But Yagoda shook her head sadly. There is no mistake. There is only one girl, in all the world, famed for hair the color of sunlight. Yagoda looked back towards the other girls in the room, none older than 10, as they chatted quietly and put their best efforts into their healing studies with childlike enthusiasm. She represents all that is wrong with the Fire Nation, that one so young could be twisted into something so. Words failed the aged healer for a moment. When she spoke, it seemed as if just uttering the words caused her pain and regret in equal measure. Evil? Evil? No, that was surely taking too far. Katara had seen evil before, first reflected in the faces of the southern raiders who took her mother, and then again in the scarred visage of Prince Zuko as he ordered her village burned. Though she served the Fire Nation too, Katara couldn't comprehend someone as young as Tanya being evil. Aang spoke with her. He said she only wanted peace, and had been lied to as to how to obtain it. I never said she chose the path she walks. Yagoda answered. But whether she has been forced onto it or not, the fact remains that Tanya has killed many people, and has not even been in the military for a decade yet. How many will have fallen at her hand by the time she becomes a woman? How old will she be when people stop counting? She shook her head sadly. Regardless of her intentions, Tanya has been turned into another weapon in the Fire Lord's armory. Do not doubt that, should the opportunity present itself, she will try to kill you, your brother, or even the Avatar without a moment's hesitation. The fate of the world rests on the Avatar defeating the Fire Lord and restoring balance. So please, Katara. Yagoda grasped her shoulders, forcing Katara to look her in the eye, and the grim resolve she found in her teacher's eyes rendered the young waterbender speechless. Stop her. Look past her age, her appearance, and even that she may not act of her own free will. For the sake of the entire world, if she threatens the Avatar then you must, no matter what the cost, stop her. Chapter 37. Zuko was struggling to escape the foul mood that had caught him. He had chased the Avatar quite literally halfway around the world. Day and night, sun or storm, he had pursued the last Airbender's trail from the South Pole all the way across the Earth Kingdom. He'd had more chances than anyone to capture the Avatar before he could reach the North Pole and master more than one element. Yet he'd failed. The Avatar had reached the North Pole. Poor Zuzu. Can't do anything right, can you? Azula's taunting voice echoed in his head, and Zuko pressed his pillow against his ears in an effort to block it out. He hadn't failed yet. He hadn't. Admittedly it would be more difficult to capture the Avatar when he could bend water as well as air, but since when had he allowed himself to give up because a task seemed too difficult? The Avatar wasn't invincible, and he only had to succeed once. So what if Azula would have got it right the first time? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Zuko looked up just as his uncle entered the room. For the last time, I'm not playing the Tsunji horn. He growled, irritated by Uncle's persistent attempts to cheer him up. Yet Uncle wasn't smiling as he'd been expecting him to. No, it's about our plans. The older man replied, looking unusually worried. There's a bit of a problem. You play the Tsunji horn? Wow Zuko, you never told me that. Zuko shot to his feet at the sound of the dreaded voice he'd been hearing far too often recently. Lo and behold, there in his doorway stood Tanya, his rival in the hunt for the Avatar, in all her 5-foot glory. And from the Cheshire grin on her face he knew she was up to something. What do you want? He snarled aggressively. Tanya raised her hands in a placating gesture, and Zuko noticed the bandages wrapped around one of her forearms. She'd been injured? For all the time she spent sparring with Azula when they were kids, Zuko had never seen Tanya seriously hurt before. Please Zuko, I promise I come in peace. I just want to catch up with a friend. Is that so much to ask? Friends? Zuko scoffed. Funny, you didn't seem too friendly when you were trying to steal the Avatar from me. I admit, that wasn't my nicest moment. I'm sorry about that. Tanya replied. I was under orders from Zhao. And I know that's no excuse for trying to steal the one thing you need to reclaim your birthright, but I really did think I was doing what was best for the Fire Nation. Tanya offered him an apologetic smile. Had he not grown up around Azula perhaps he would have believed it was sincere, but Zuko had seen enough fake smiles to spot one a mile away. Still the fact that she was bothering with deception at all meant that she needed something from him, which was curious given their positions. Still that's all water under the bridge now. Things have changed recently, and I was actually hoping that perhaps we could take another shot at coming to some kind of a deal. Zuko snorted. What? Zhao's decided that he doesn't mind you running around making bargains with me now. Zhao won't mind anything Zuko. He's dead. That caught Zuko by surprise, as well as Uncle if the widening of his eyes was any indication. Dead? How? Uncle asked. Has the news not reached you yet? Tanya asked innocently. He was killed by the Avatar a few days ago. Killed? By the Avatar? Zuko was stunned. That couldn't be the case. He'd fought the Avatar more than anyone, and the young nomad seemed to go out of his way to avoid even hurting his enemies. The thought of that peace-loving child murdering someone just didn't seem possible. We caught wind that the Avatar was being trained in firebending by Zhao's own treacherous master, Ex-Admiral Jeong. Tanya continued. Zhao insisted on fighting the Avatar alone. When I returned I found Zhao dying on the ground with a huge hole in his back. The Avatar had struck him from behind. Tanya's face was completely serious, with no tells he could see signaling a lie, yet Zuko's gut instincts screamed at him that it couldn't be true. But then again, who else could it be? The Avatar was the only one who fought Zhao. Come to think of it, he had seen the Avatar unleash a hidden fury back during their first encounter at the South Pole. In that moment when his eyes and tattoos had started glowing, he'd seemed ready to drown Zuko's entire crew if needed. And what of Admiral Jeong? Uncle asked. Is he now traveling with the Avatar? Jeong Jeong is dead. I killed him myself. Tanya said those words with startling indifference, as if merely remarking on the weather, yet the reaction they had on Uncle was immediate. His face paled, eyes growing wide with disbelief. Dead? Oh. Tanya raised an eyebrow. I didn't know the two of you were acquainted. Uncle seemed to be wrestling with some sort of emotion Zuko couldn't identify. We met a long time ago, back when we were both young men serving in the military. He replied, sounding very weary all of a sudden. Silently, Zuko put a hand on his shoulder and steered Uncle to sit down on his bed. He was always a very powerful fighter. Tanya chuckled to herself. Yes, he did take a considerable amount of effort to put down. For a moment so brief he could have imagined it, Zuko thought he saw a flash of genuine hatred in his uncle's eternally patient eyes. Yet just as soon as it had come it was gone. Tanya didn't seem to notice, so Zuko assumed he must have misread the look. Why would Uncle get angry over the death of a traitor after all? So with Zhao gone, that means the one in charge of his fleet is... Zuko began, trailing off as the Cheshire smile on Tanya's lips returned. Oh Agni! You! Indeed! Which brings me back to the reason why I'm here. Tanya replied, inviting herself to sit down on his vacant chair. You know me, Zuko. All I've ever wanted was to become an admiral, and now that I'm an acting admiral I just need one big achievement to solidify my position. Let me guess, capturing the Avatar. Zuko sneered. Tanya rolled her eyes. No Zuko, not that. The Avatar is a threat to the Fire Nation that must be dealt with as soon as possible, but I don't need capturing him to be my crowning achievement. I have another plan in mind, something that will help both of us get what we want. Memories of all the times Azula had claimed to have such plans flashed through Zuko's mind. She'd always been lying of course, manipulating him into doing something that suited her purposes, and often getting him into trouble along the way. Tanya had never done that before, but then again she had never really needed to ask anyone else for help. She always seemed completely capable of doing everything herself. Zuko found himself unsure as to whether he could trust her or not. What plan? He asked warily. Tanya's smile grew sharper. You're aware that the Avatar has reached the North Pole by now, yes? What's your plan to kidnap him right under all those waterbending masters' noses? I'm working on it. Really? Tanya shot him a teasing smirk. I half expected you to try and just bulldoze your way in through the front gates. Zuko growled, unamused, and Tanya held up her hands in mock surrender. Sorry, couldn't resist. But as it so happens I might be able to provide you with the perfect opportunity to capture the Avatar once and for all. Really? Zuko huffed sarcastically. What are you going to do? Conquer the North Pole? Tanya didn't refute him. Instead her smirk grew, and Zuko's good eye widened in astonishment. Oh spirits! That's your plan? I can't take all the credit. Tanya replied smugly. Zhao began building the fleet for the invasion, and came up with the initial idea our strategy is based on. I just fine-tuned it a little. The predatory gleam she got whenever she was scheming something big flashed in her eyes. I believe we can conquer the Northern Water Tribe within 3 days. The only complication is that the Avatar will no doubt pull some spiritual mumbo-jumbo out of his ass to foil my plans again, and with my arm currently injured I'm in no fit state to fight him. He's a wild card that has the potential to ruin everything, unless of course someone, say for example a certain banished prince with more experience hunting avatars than anyone, were to take him out of the picture for me. Understanding dawned on Zuko like the sun rising on the horizon. You want to help me capture the Avatar, so that the Avatar can't stop you taking the north. Bingo! Tanya smiled that wide, wicked grin that caused such terror in anyone who saw it. You get the Avatar, and get to return home. I get the North Pole, and my position of Admiral will be secured. We both get exactly what we want. He could do it. He could really do it. With the backing of Tanya's fleet he stood a chance of capturing the Avatar even in the North Pole. This was his chance. I'm in. He agreed readily, unable to keep the naked interest in tone hidden. What do I need to do? I'm glad to hear it. Tanya replied, passing him a note. Follow this heading to join up with my fleet tomorrow. We'll discuss the plan in more detail there. Zuko nodded. I'll be there. I know you will. Tanya smirked and stood up, heading for the door, then stopped abruptly. Oh, just one more thing. This invasion will be undoubtedly risky, and while your participation is unavoidable, I wouldn't feel safe risking other members of the royal family unnecessarily. She turned back around, and Zuko suddenly got the sense he'd walked into a trap. While you and your crew are welcome to come, I'm going to have to insist that you drop General Iroh off to wait at the nearest town until we get back. What? Uncle was on his feet in an instant, a look of panic on his face. I'm not leaving Zuko to go into battle alone. He won't be alone. Tanya retorted so quickly that Zuko suspected she'd prepared her answer beforehand. He'll be with me, and surrounded by an elite team of my finest soldiers. Zuko stood up and placed a hand on Uncle's shoulder, glaring at Tanya. Uncle is the wisest man I know, and a great strategist. He won't be a liability, and anything you can say to me, you can say in front of him. Tanya frowned. Actually I can't. I informed your father of my plan, and he made it clear that it was to be kept top secret. I may only share the plan with those who need to know. As wise as I'm sure General Iroh is, he won't be able to join you in your infiltration of the Water Tribe, and as such may not be allowed to know what I am prepared to tell you. Zuko looked like he wanted to argue, but Tanya spun on her heel and began walking away. It's your choice, Zuko, but if you want this shot at capturing the Avatar before I give it to someone else in my invasion force, you must leave your uncle behind. You have until tomorrow to decide. Chapter 38. Again. Aang tried, and failed, to suppress his groan at Master Pakku's command. The elderly waterbending master was stern and severely lacking in compassion, instructing him to go through the same forms over and over without rest until he got them right. Aang's arms moved in serpentine motions, pushing and pulling the water so as to coax it into the shape he desired. The water flowed upwards at his command, spiraling around him in a way that reminded him of airbending. Unlike airbending, however, the water was heavy, and its weight fought against his grasp with every motion. A moment's slip in concentration caused it to slip out of his control as if through a crack in a bowl. Concentrate! Pakku snapped. I'm trying. Aang growled back. Try harder. Aang did try. He really did. But hours of practice had worn his concentration down to a dull edge. As he repeated the motion again, the water sloshed and slurred lazily, rising briefly into the air before sluggishly crashing back down again. Aang expected more harsh words of disapproval, but all he got from Pakku was a tut of disapproval before the aging master turned his back to him. We're done for today, he declared, already walking away. Perhaps tomorrow you might actually be in the mood to take this seriously. Jerk. Aang was not usually the judgmental type, but everything Pakku had done today, from his refusal to train Katara to his strict training and heavy use of criticism, had fostered the beginnings of an intense dislike in the young nomad. Avatar. How was your first day of training? Aang looked over to see Arnook, the chief of the northern tribe, approaching, a gentle if not somewhat forced smile on his face. Aang bowed politely. Chief. What brings you here? It would be remiss of me not to check on my honored guest's first day. The chief replied. Somehow Aang doubted that Katara and Sokka would receive the same courtesy, but kept that to himself. So, how was your training? Frustrating. Aang replied, the temper he'd been keeping bottled up finally finding a way to release itself. He was snarky, stubborn and, just plain mean. Arnook shot him a sympathetic smile. My apologies, Avatar. Master Pakku is the best waterbender, and the best teacher, that the northern tribe has to offer. Sadly he received news that a dear friend of his passed away recently, and he has yet to find the time to grieve. Aang's temper deflated in an instant. Oh, I'm so sorry. He whispered, now silently regretting the attitude he'd been giving Pakku. He'd thought the waterbending master to be just a mean old man, but to realize that he was hurting stole the wind from his sails. Were they close? Very. The chief replied, a fond smile crossing his face. Not that either of them would ever admit it. A stubborn pair, the both of them. They met years ago as young men during the height of the war, and fought each other many times across the four corners of the world. They fought? Aang asked, his eyes widening in realization. His friend was a firebender. Indeed. And a powerful one at that. Arnook answered. They despised one another at the beginning, but neither could help but respect the other's skill and courage even when it was turned against them. The honor and mercy they showed to one another in victory eventually created a mutual, if a little grudging, sense of kinship. When Admiral Jeong eventually expressed a desire to defect, it was Pakku who helped him survive the difficult transition. Jeong Jeong! Aang cried with alarm. Arnook looked taken aback by the sudden noise. Yes, that was his name. Admiral Jeong Jeong, the first man to desert the Fire Nation and live. But he can't be dead. Aang refuted. I met him only a couple of weeks ago. He taught me a little fire bending, and helped me to escape the Fire Nation. A pitying look crossed the chief's face. Avatar. Jeong Jeong was killed by a Fire Nation a couple of weeks ago. no. No. Aang felt faint, a well of guilt washing up from his stomach and making him feel like throwing up. Jeong Jeong had given his life so that he could escape. How, dash. Reports say that he fought Tanya, the devil of the South Sea, in one-on-one combat. Arnook continued. Their battle raised the forest for miles around. An image of the golden-haired girl he'd spoken to back at the stronghold flashed through Aang's mind. That Tanya. She had killed Jeong Jeong. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Arnook offered sympathetically, placing a hand on Aang's shoulder. If the rest of the Fire Nation was even half as wise as him, this war would have never started. Aang nodded, but in truth he barely heard Arnook's words. His mind was a haze of conflicting emotions. He hadn't known Jeong Jeong for long, but the old firebender had left a lasting impression. Guilt, regret and anger wormed away inside his gut, leaving him confused as to how he was supposed to feel. That day at the stronghold, when he had spoke with Tanya and been saved by Zuko, he had seen a glimpse of the way the world could be again if reconciliation with the Fire Nation was reached. Now, he wasn't so sure if that had just been an impossible dream after all. The sun had yet to even begin rising the next morning when Zuko's ship appeared at Tanya's military camp, blending silently into the mass of other metal warships without a second glance. With clockwork efficiency the crew members were registered and reassigned to positions across the fleet suitable for their skill sets, and within the hour Zuko's ship was no longer his own, now just one of the many hundreds of war machines that sailed on Tanya's bidding. Zuko himself made his way straight to the command tent and barged his way in, only to find Tanya awake and in full uniform, sitting at the meeting table as if she'd been expecting him. The smile she gave him seemed pleasant enough, but had a superior edge that made Zuko feel like he was being manipulated. "Prince Zuko," she began politely. "A pleasure as always. I trust you've come to a decision then." Of course he had. His presence here made it obvious enough. That Tanya insisted he say it felt to him like the kind of subtle power play he'd heard often enough from the governors his father surrounded himself with. "I have," he replied. "I'll work with you." "Good. And General Iroh?" A flash of guilt crossed Zuko's face. "Uncle has agreed to stay behind." A victorious gleam shimmered in Tanya's eyes. "Excellent. He didn't take it too hard, I hope." "He may have needed some convincing," Zuko answered, looking down at the floor. "But he eventually saw sense." "I'm glad to hear that." Tanya stood up and circled around the table, pulling out a seat for him. "I apologize if I've seemed harsh, but secrecy is paramount to my invasion plan. If the Water Tribe hears so much as a whisper of what I'm planning, everything will be for nothing. Not even my commanders know the full picture. For this to work the only people who know everything will be you and I." Zuko frowned, but took the offered seat. "And what exactly is this plan?" There was no answer for a second, but just as Zuko was about to look around, Tanya's arm snaked out from close beside him and set a scroll down on the table in front of him. It was old and worn, like the kind uncle liked to collect on their travels, but something about it filled Zuko with a sense of trepidation. "The plan, Zuko, is to tip the very balance of the world in our favor," Tanya whispered in his ear conspiratorially, like a witch enthralling her victim with dark magic. "And it all begins with a pond, and two spirits who long ago made a very poor decision." Chapter 39. The room Zuko had been given was the VIP quarters on Tanya's flagship, Ajalan's Revenge, and was second only to the Admiral's in terms of luxury. Rich red flags embroidered with the black symbol of the Fire Nation hung beside tasteful paintings of famous military leaders and old battles, and furniture of fine, polished wood surrounded a large double bed with a mattress stuffed to burst with the finest feathers, and draped in soft red silks. It was the sort of refinery he'd grown up in, a taste of the opulence befitting someone of his birthright. Yet after years of knowing nothing but the rusted iron walls of his ship and the barest necessities packed within, Zuko was surprised to find himself uncomfortable with all the comforts he'd been afforded. The exiled prince ran a finger over the good filigree embedded around the edges of his wardrobe, wondering how it was that the royal treasury had been able to afford such lavish decorations for this room, yet had not been able to find a door for his old ship that didn't have broken hinges. Why was it that back in the homeland, the War Council feasted on 5-course meals after every meeting, yet soldiers on the front lines in the Earth Kingdom often went for weeks on nothing but ration bars and water? Why did the workers in the colony towns he'd visited slave away to build mansions for their governors, whilst so many of them lived in slums or the burned ruins of houses? The goal of the Fire Nation was to share its prosperity with the rest of the world, yet that prosperity only seemed to reach a select few places. A knock at the door broke him out of his thoughts. "Enter," he called, and watched warily as one of the fully armored soldiers who stood guard outside of his room entered, and bowed respectfully in a way that none of his crew ever had done. "My prince," the soldier intoned. "One of the chefs has come to see you. He claims he has your nightly tea. Send him in," Zuko replied, and the guard saluted sharply as if given an order of highest priority. A second later an elderly man with a grey cook's apron stretched across his portly stomach hobbled in, holding a tray with the kind of tea sets reserved for nobility stacked neatly upon it. When the soldier did not leave, Zuko nodded at him dismissively. "Thank you. That will be all." "My prince," the soldier replied hesitantly. "My orders are to not leave you alone with any potentially dangerous guests." "Mushi was the chef on my previous ship," Zuko interrupted. "For the past couple of years he has prepared my tea every night. He is hardly suspicious." The soldier thought for a moment, then bowed again. "As you say, my prince. I will be outside should you call." He turned and marched out the room, closing the door carefully behind him, and Zuko knelt down before the low table where the chef was setting up his tea. "Mushi? Is that the best name you could come up with?" the chef grumbled. Zuko huffed irritably. "Perhaps if you hadn't caught me by surprise, uncle, I would have had time to come up with something better. What's with the chef outfit anyway? I thought you were going to disguise yourself as a soldier." Uncle grinned in that mischievously goofy way he always did when he'd done something foolish for the sake of his hobbies. "I was. But then I saw this beautiful tea set, and realized that by taking this disguise we could enjoy some delicious blue jasmine during our journey." Zuko had not been comfortable with the deception initially. If Tanya found out, it was sure to cost him perhaps the best chance he'd ever get to finally catch the Avatar. Yet Tanya's insistence on leaving Uncle behind hadn't sat right with either of them. There was only one person left in the world who Zuko could fully place his trust in, one person who had steadfastly stayed by his side no matter what dark and dangerous twists his life had taken. Why would Tanya want to remove the only one whose loyalty to Zuko was without question? What could she possibly gain from excluding a man renowned for his wisdom and military acumen from an invasion? The only way it made sense was if Tanya was planning to trick Zuko somehow. Uncle was wise and experienced enough to see through most deceptions, and was not afraid to offer Zuko counsel even when he was at the height of his temper. Nor could he be bought, bullied, or blackmailed into betraying his nephew, for he had proven many times that there was nothing he cared more about. Uncle was his shield against scheming and trickery, and Tanya's attempts to have him discard that shield suggested that she had some sort of machinations in store. "So how was your meeting, Prince Zuko?" Uncle asked, pouring tea with practiced precision into both of their cups. "Did Tanya tell you her plan?" "She did," Zuko confirmed. "More than I expected actually. I'm the only person she's shared the entire invasion plan with." When a doubtful frown crossed Uncle's face, Zuko raised his eyebrow questioningly. "You think she was lying?" "There is an old saying among generals. To deceive your enemies, you must first deceive your friends." Uncle replied sagely, sipping his tea. "Imagine this. Tanya begins by telling each of her commanding officers that the plan is so secret, so important, that each of them is only allowed to know enough to fulfill their small part in it. Though outraged, her commanders cannot help but find themselves curious. What could possibly be so special about this plan that even they, the highest ranked, cannot be allowed to know it?" Uncle sipped his tea. "Then one by one each of them receives a message, telling them to meet Tanya in private. There she tells them that she can trust them, and only them, to fulfill a special role, something she believes only they could possibly accomplish. And so she tells them a version of the great plan where their role will be the deciding factors between victory and defeat. Something that will earn them great glory and the favor of the Fire Lord. Now each commander believes that they are special, that they are important enough, worthy enough, to be set apart from the rest. They believe they alone are Tanya's chosen one, that they are uniquely respected, valued, and that they will be rewarded so long as they obey her and keep it a secret from their peers. Suddenly everyone is loyal to Tanya before each other, and is more than happy to report on any behavior from their peers that could oppose her. While together they could have provided a united front against the upstart child that stole the commanding position above them, now each is turned upon the other. And if any of them do reveal the top secret information revealed to them, Tanya will know who the traitor is, for the great plan she told them was different for everyone." Uncle sipped his tea again. Tanya's greatest threat was insubordination due to resentment caused by her own meteoric rise. Through this deception she turns her greatest threats against each other, keeping her own position secure. It is a tactic your father has employed frequently. But I'm not a member of her commanding staff. Why bother working the same deception on me? Zuko asked. To get you to do something you would otherwise be hesitant to do. Few soldiers would charge at an enemy force that greatly outnumbered their own, unless they believed that another group was about to charge from the other side at the same time. Uncle put his cup down and stared into Zuko's eyes. Think not about what Tanya claims her master plan is, Prince Zuko. Look only at what she is asking you to do. It is there that the hints to her true intentions will be. Zuko fidgeted with the corners of his own cup uncomfortably. What if she's telling the truth though, uncle? She was never as bad as Azula. Tanya put a lot of stock in making her word mean something, and never seemed afraid to admit to making a mistake. What few mistakes she made anyway. Uncle shook his head sadly. I believe her web of deceit has already begun. Remember what she said about Zhao's murder? Zuko nodded his head. That it was the Avatar who did it. I felt unsure about that too. He's always been so careful about causing lasting harm to anyone before. I agree. The air nomads believed very strongly that nobody deserved to pay with their life, no matter what their crime. Then who did it? Zuko asked. Many soldiers witnessed Zhao begin fighting the Avatar alone. Uncle nodded. Indeed. And those same soldiers also found Zhao dead a few minutes later. There was only one person who discovered Zhao's body before them. One other person who was alone with Zhao in that brief span of time his guards were away. Uncle downed his tea and set it down, his expression grave. I think we have to consider the possibility that the one who killed Zhao was none other than Tanya herself. Chapter 40. One other person who was alone with Zhao in that brief span of time his guards were away. Uncle downed his tea and set it down, his expression grave. I think we have to consider the possibility that the one who killed Zhao was none other than Tanya herself. Zuko very nearly spat out his tea, catching himself at the last minute as he remembered the guard waiting outside for any hint of trouble. No. That can't be right. Zuko hissed. Tanya's known Zhao since she was a little girl. And she's the poster child of the perfect, loyal soldier. She'd never commit treason. Iroh began to slowly pour himself another cup of tea. I've made a few friends among this fleet, and some of them shared some interesting news. Remember those fire sages back at the temple where the Avatar sought to contact Roku? A few weeks ago Zhao had them executed in front of everyone, Tanya included. He sighed heavily at the pointless loss of life. Few people remember these days, but before Tanya became your father's golden girl she was raised by the fire sages. It is not impossible that she sought revenge for their unjust execution. And besides, she's always said she wanted to be an admiral. Zhao's death provided the opportunity to instantly achieve what might have taken her years otherwise. Tanya was the killer. Though the thought was shocking, Zuko found that theory more plausible to his instincts than the Avatar being the culprit. He felt somewhat ashamed to admit that, as Tanya was one of his sister's best friends and someone he had known since childhood, but equally it was because of that shared history that he knew how utterly ruthless she could be when pursuing something she wanted. It wasn't that Tanya lacked morals, but that her moral compass had always pointed in a slightly different direction than most other people's. Zuko still wasn't quite sure what exactly she considered to be good and evil, but he was certain she didn't think that murder was in itself an evil act. Sensing that Zuko was coming around to his line of thinking, Uncle continued. What has Tanya told you her plan is? And so Zuko told him the plan Tanya had explained to him, beginning with the ancient scroll she'd set down in front of him. Uncle, normally so composed and carefree, looked downright panicked right from the start, and only became more horrified as the story continued. Yet he listened silently as Zuko recited the plan, and only when he was finished did Uncle then lean over the table and calmly but firmly grasp him by the shoulders. Listen to me, Zuko. Uncle began, his voice slow and deliberate, yet with an underlying note of urgency that could not be ignored. His grasp kept Zuko's eyes locked on his. Tanya is trying to play with forces she does not understand. The actions she is trying to convince you to undertake will spell disaster not just for the water tribes, but the Fire Nation and the rest of the world as well. She is attempting to meddle with the very balance of nature itself. Please Zuko, if ever you have heeded my advice, let it be now. You must not do this. Zuko found himself taken aback by Uncle's insistence. He had never heard him speak so forcefully before. I'll be careful, Uncle. He choked out. But unless I go along with Tanya's plan, I'll miss the best chance I'll ever have to capture the Avatar. I cannot let that slip me by. And if I don't do it, she'll just send someone else in her fleet. A tired sign escaped Uncle's lips, and his downcast eyes turned to stare forlornly at his teacup. Someone who will not show the same care as you would. That is true. If she is so set upon this plan of hers, it would be better if you were in a position to influence its outcome than a stranger. Setting his cup aside, Uncle clasped Zuko's hands between his own. I understand why you can't give this up, my nephew. But promise me this. If Tanya ever asks you to do something that you feel in your heart is wrong, do not do it. Your sense of honor is one of your greatest strengths. Trust in your heart. I will, Uncle. Zuko replied, meaning every word. Uncle was the only family he had left that did not see him as a disappointment. He would not allow anything to change that. Tanya strode to the balcony of the helm, looking out across the sea stretching endlessly into the midday horizon before her. At her back a fleet of hundreds of black iron ships stood primed and ready, waiting on her command to set sail. The full moon would be arriving soon. How strange it was to think her entire future was wagered upon the outcome of one single night. Would it be known as her greatest triumph, or her greatest folly? Though she kept an iron expression up in front of her subordinates, Tanya could not help but feel a twinge of nervousness. This strategy was the magnum opus of her military career, yet for all the backup plans she had devised to account for every possible situation, the fact remained that she had built her invasion around information found in some dusty old scroll that Zhao had dug up from who knew where. If the identity of the ocean and moon spirits was incorrect after all, then the chances of her invasion succeeding plummeted drastically. And even assuming it was, there was no telling what the Avatar might have waiting in store to stop her. Yes, it was no exaggeration in her mind to say that the outcome of that night would be decided by the actions of just three people, herself, the Avatar, and Zuko. Everyone else was just a pawn on the board, and she was willing to sacrifice every piece she had if that was what it took to put the North Pole in checkmate. The time is now, she announced, slowly raising one hand to point theatrically in the direction of the North Pole. Set a course for the Northern Water Tribe. Wow, I can't believe you do this every day. In Sokka's eyes, life seemed just about perfect right now. Up on Appa's back, the troubles of the world below felt so far away. In the sky there was no war, no Fire Nation, and no duty to protect the Avatar. There was just him and you, the girl he couldn't stop thinking about since the moment he'd laid eyes upon her. Yet, we pretty much live up here. He boasted, stretching in a way that he hoped seemed cool and casual. There hadn't been any girls in the Southern Water Tribes near to his age besides his sister, and despite his bravado Sokka was finding every moment he spent with you a little nerve-wracking. What if he put his foot in his mouth and said something stupid, like he so often did, that made you hate him? He still wasn't sure what it was that he'd said that'd made you cry and run away from him on the bridge a few days after they'd first arrived. Is it always this cold in the sky? A warmth settled against his side, and Sokka glanced over to see that you had scooted closer over towards him. Cold? It felt pretty hot up here to him. Not when you're with someone. He stammered out. You turned to look at him. It must have been the frosty sky air stinging her face, but Sokka could swear that she was blushing. It's beautiful up here, she whispered. Yet. But not as beautiful as you. Spirits, what he wouldn't give to be able to say that out loud. But he knew that if he did, you would probably feel uncomfortable again and want to leave. It was painful trying to keep the words he was desperate to say bottled up. Surely you deserved to know how incredible she was? Deserved to know that she was so funny, so wise and mature beyond her years, and so captivating when she smiled. Sokka's eyes widened as he realized that, without thinking, his face had ended up a hair's breadth away from Yu's, his lips a second away from meeting hers. But if he kissed her now, she'd only become filled with more confusion and doubt. And as much as he longed to kiss her, he also didn't want to give her any more reasons not to smile. Woo, yet. He all but yelled, jolting backwards and pretending to act cool. Ah, good times, good times. Yu's face was as red as the wine he'd seen people in the Earth Kingdom drink, and he was pretty sure his wasn't much different. Yet to acknowledge that would be to acknowledge this thing between them, and that would make you unhappy. A flicker of black crossed his vision. Sokka looked around, noticing for the first time streaks of black that were beginning to fall around them. Hey, look! Snowflakes as black as coal were starting to drift lazily down from above, only a handful at first, but every time he blinked Sokka could swear that they multiplied. Within a span of just a few seconds the sky was stained with dark flecks. Down below them the pristine white snow and rich blue water of the northern water tribe was slowly but surely being dyed a murky grey. Yu raised a hand, catching one of the black flakes in her palm. It melted in a second, leaving behind a sooty grey stain. "What's happening?" she asked. Sokka knew. It had been years since he'd last seen black snow falling from the sky, but he had never forgotten a single day when they had. Each time the black snow fell, members of his village would be gone the next morning. He flicked the reins, bringing Appa back down to land, and jumped off the saddle to scoop up a handful of the black-stained snow. "Soot!" he muttered, recognizing the filth. "What?" Yu asked. "I've seen this before, right before my village was attacked," Sokka replied, standing up. "It's soot mixed with snow." "But why?" Yu was looking back to her home with concern, unsettled by the palpable shadow that was being cast over it. "It's the Fire Nation," Sokka answered. "Just when he'd thought they'd found somewhere safe from those monsters. They've closed in on the North Pole. And from the looks of this stuff, I'd say there's a lot of them."
Thanks for listening.